Some wisdom doesn't need to be understood with the mind. It only needs to be felt with the heart in stillness, in silence. This is week 1 of Buddhist wisdom, a gentle invitation to step into stillness, to listen, not just with your ears, but with your whole being. In this journey, we'll explore 5 timeless lessons, insights that have the power to shift your mind, soften your heart, and bring clarity to the way you move through life. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to remember everything. Just let the words wash over you, like waves meeting the shore. As you listen, you may find that your thoughts settle, your body relaxes, and sleep comes naturally. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll awaken to something deeper. Let's begin. Namaste, dear friends. Take a deep breath. Let this moment settle around you like morning mist over a quiet lake. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like you're doing everything right? Working hard, chasing goals, following the path you were told would lead to happiness. But still, something feels missing? Like no matter how much you accomplish, how much you gather, the feeling of true peace always seems just out of reach. Buddhism teaches us something profound. Peace isn't something we find out there. It's something we uncover within. The secret isn't in doing more, but in seeing differently. Today, we'll explore 7 timeless Buddhist teachings that illuminate the path to lasting happiness. Some of them might surprise you, especially the 5th one. It holds a key that most people overlook, yet it has the power to change how you experience life entirely. So, if you're ready, let's take this journey together. Let's begin. 1. Live in the present moment. The rain had just stopped. The temple grounds were soaked in the scent of wet earth and blooming jasmine. A gentle mist curled around the stone pathways, clinging to the wooden beams of the old meditation hall. Somewhere in the distance, a single bird called out, a brief, sweet note that faded as quickly as it had come. I sat beneath the Bodhi tree, legs crossed, hands resting lightly in my lap. A cup of warm tea sat beside me, wisps of steam curling into the cool morning air. And yet my mind wasn't here. It was running, darting between the tangled threads of yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's worries. The words of an unfinished conversation, the weight of an old mistake, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. It was as if I was everywhere but here, lost in places that no longer existed or had yet to arrive. The abbot, an old monk with a gentle smile and a gaze that seemed to see right through the noise of the world, had noticed my distraction. He walked toward me, his bare feet making no sound on the damp stone. Without a word, he lowered himself onto the ground beside me and gestured toward the tree. "Do you see this tree?" he asked softly. I nodded, unsure where this was going. It does not regret the storm that passed last night, nor does it worry about whether the sun will shine tomorrow. It simply is. I looked at the Bodhi tree, its broad leaves still glistening with rain, its roots deeply embedded in the earth. It stood there, undisturbed by time, existing fully in this moment. The monk continued, "You were like this tree, or at least you were when you were a child. Do you remember how, as a child, you could lose yourself completely in play? How an afternoon felt endless because you were fully in it. But as we grow older, we forget. We fill our minds with regrets, anxieties, distractions. We leave the present moment again and again, chasing illusions." I wanted to argue, to explain that life wasn't that simple. There were things to plan for, responsibilities to bear. But something in his words struck a chord so deep that I simply sat there, silent. "Take a breath," he said. I did. "Do you feel it?" I nodded. "That breath is all that is real. The past is a memory. The future is imagination. But this," he tapped his fingers lightly against the stone beside us, "this is where life happens." For the first time in what felt like a long time, I allowed myself to truly arrive. I noticed the weight of my body against the earth, the warmth of the tea, the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I had been chasing moments, running ahead of myself, trying to grasp happiness in a place where it didn't exist. Anywhere but here. I thought back to how often my mind had stolen me from life itself. Walking to work, but lost in thoughts of what needed to be done. Eating a meal, but already thinking about the next task. Talking to a loved one, but half present, checking my phone or replaying a past conversation. How many moments had I missed? How many simple joys had slipped through my fingers? I remembered a friend telling me once, "Life is like tea. If you drink it quickly, distracted, you miss the flavor. But if you drink it slowly, you taste everything." I looked down at my untouched tea, now lukewarm, and smiled. The monk spoke again, his voice as steady as the rain that had just passed. "The mind will always wander. It is its nature. But each time you notice it drifting, gently bring it back. Like a candle flame flickering in the wind, return it to stillness." He stood up, brushing the damp fabric of his robe. "And when you eat," he added with a knowing glance, "just eat." That night, I practiced something simple. I ate my meal without a phone, without distractions, without rushing. I felt the warmth of the food, noticed the textures, the flavors. It was such a small thing, but it was life. And for the first time in a long time, I was there for it. 2. Practice compassion. There's a story I once heard, and like all good stories, it stayed with me long after I first encountered it. Maybe because I saw a little of myself in it. Maybe because, in one way or another, we all carry invisible burdens. It was about a traveler who walked through the world with a heavy bag slung over his shoulder. Inside, he carried stones, small ones, large ones, some jagged, others smooth. But no matter their size, each stone represented a grievance, a betrayal, a wound he could not let go of. Each time someone hurt him, an insult, a broken promise, a deep disappointment, he reached down, picked up a new stone, and placed it in his bag. "This," he would say to himself, "will remind me never to trust again, never to be caught off guard, never to be hurt like that a second time." And so his collection grew. At first, he barely noticed the weight. Pebble here, a small rock there. What harm could it do? But as the years passed, as more and more stones found their way into his bag, he felt it. His steps grew slower. His back ached. His heart, too, felt heavy, though he couldn't quite explain why. One evening, after an especially long and tiring journey, the traveler stopped by a well in a small village. An old sage sat nearby, watching the world with the quiet patience of someone who had seen many lifetimes of suffering and joy. The sage saw the traveler's weary expression and the way his body sagged beneath the invisible burden he carried. He asked, "What is it that you carry in your bag?" The traveler sighed. "These are my reminders. Each stone represents a pain I have suffered, a wrong that was done to me. I keep them so I will never forget." The sage nodded, considering his words. Then he smiled gently and said, "And tell me, do those who have wronged you feel the weight of these stones?" The traveler was quiet. He had never thought about that. The sage continued, "Or is it only you who carries them?" The words struck the traveler like a bell ringing through the empty night. He felt the strain in his shoulders, the dull ache in his heart. For so long, he had believed that holding onto these stones would protect him. But all they had done was weigh him down. With trembling hands, he reached into his bag and took out a stone. He held it for a long time, feeling its rough surface. Then, finally, he let it fall. The sound of it hitting the earth was softer than he expected. He took another, and with each stone he dropped, his burden lightened. That night, for the first time in years, the traveler slept soundly, unshackled by the weight of his own past. I think about this story often, because the truth is we all carry stones. Some are small, petty grievances, misunderstandings that we refuse to let go of. Others are heavier betrayals, heartbreaks, wounds that have shaped the way we see the world. But the question remains, who really carries the weight of our resentment? It's easy to believe that holding on to anger somehow protects us, that remembering every slight keeps us from being hurt again. But in reality, the people who wronged us, they aren't the ones bearing the burden. We are. I used to think of compassion as something soft, something reserved for those who deserved it. But the older I get, the more I understand. compassion is not about excusing harm. It's about freeing ourselves from the endless cycle of suffering. There was a time in my life when I held on to anger like a shield. I thought that if I stayed resentful, I could control the pain. If I replayed the moment enough times in my head, I could rewrite the ending. But it never worked. The past remained the past, and I remained trapped in it. Then one day I tried something different. Instead of asking, "How could they do this to me?" I asked, "What pain might they have been carrying?" And just like that, the weight began to shift. It didn't mean I forgot. It didn't mean what happened was okay. But it did mean that I no longer let it dictate my peace. Compassion isn't just about helping others. It's about setting ourselves free. The Buddha once said, "If you light a lamp for someone else, it will also brighten your own path." And maybe, just maybe, if we let go of the stones we carry, we'll find that the road ahead is lighter than we ever imagined. The first time I truly understood simplicity, I was sitting on the worn wooden steps of an old monastery, watching the wind play with the fallen leaves. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of incense and damp earth. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty but full of something deeper than words. An elderly monk sat beside me, his robe a deep shade of saffron, faded at the edges. He had been watching me for a while, his eyes twinkling with a kind of knowing that made me feel both exposed and comforted at the same time. Finally, he spoke. "You seem troubled," he said simply. I sighed. I don't know why, but I always feel like something is missing, like I'm always reaching for something just out of grasp. The monk nodded as if he had heard these words 1,000 times before. "Let me tell you a story. There was once a great king who had everything. Gold, jewels, the finest silk, the most exquisite food. He lived in a palace that stretched so wide it took an entire day just to walk from one end to the other. And yet, despite all this, the king was restless. He found no joy in his riches, no satisfaction in his power. One day, he heard of a wise monk who lived in the mountains, a man rumored to hold the secret to true happiness. The king, desperate to fill the emptiness inside him, set out on a journey to find the monk. After days of travel, he finally arrived at the monastery. The monk welcomed him with a warm smile and a bowl of simple rice. The king wasted no time. "Tell me, wise one," he said, "why am I not happy? I have everything a man could ever want, and yet I feel a constant hunger for more." The monk studied the king for a moment before asking, "If you were thirsty, would drinking the ocean satisfy you?" The king blinked. "Of course not. The ocean is too vast, too salty. It would never quench my thirst." The monk smiled. "Then why do you think endless wealth and possessions would satisfy your heart?" The king was silent. The monk continued, "You have built a great palace, but your mind is still restless. Happiness is not found in having, but in being." The king left that day, confused but intrigued. He started to notice how each new treasure he acquired only made him crave another. Slowly, he began giving away his possessions one by one. The more he let go, the lighter he felt. And over time, he discovered that the greatest treasure of all was not gold or jewels, but the peace that comes with needing nothing. The old monk beside me let the story settle in the air between us before finally speaking again. "What do you think the king learned?" I hesitated. "That the more we chase, the more we suffer?" The monk nodded. "Yes, but even more than that, he learned that what we think we need is often what weighs us down the most." I looked down at my hands. The past few years of my life had been a blur of endless goals, a constant need for more success, more achievements, more possessions. I had believed that happiness was something to be earned, something I would reach once I had accumulated enough. But what was enough? The truth was, the more I got, the more I wanted. I had been drinking the ocean, expecting it to quench my thirst. I thought back to the moments in my life when I had felt the most at peace. They weren't the times I had achieved something grand or bought something expensive. They were the simple moments, sitting quietly with a friend, walking barefoot on a beach, drinking a cup of tea while watching the rain. The monk must have seen the realization settle in my face because he chuckled softly. The modern world tells us that more is the answer. More possessions, more distractions, more everything. But Buddhism teaches us that true contentment comes not from having more, but from needing less. I glanced around the monastery, taking in its simplicity. There were no extravagant decorations, no unnecessary luxuries. Just a wooden bench, a few candles, and a garden where lotus flowers bloomed in the still water. And yet, there was a peace here that I had never found in all the expensive places I had been. I looked back at the monk. So, where do I start? He smiled. Start small. Look around you. Is there something you own but never use? Let it go. Is there a thought you keep replaying? Something you can't change? Release it. Simplicity isn't about deprivation. It's about making space for what truly matters. That night, I returned to my small guest room in the monastery and looked at the few things I had brought with me. A book I had carried but never opened. A watch I kept checking even though time moved the same with or without it. A journal filled not with reflections but with lists of things I needed to do, achieve, become. One by one, I set them aside. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. I used to believe that if I held on tightly enough, things wouldn't slip away. That if I clenched my fists around love, success, and certainty, they would stay safe and secure, exactly as I wanted them to be. But life has a way of teaching us differently. There was a time when I held onto a dream so fiercely that I didn't realize it had already withered in my grasp. I had poured years into it. Late nights, early mornings, endless effort. It was supposed to be my future, the thing that defined me. But when it started slipping through my fingers, instead of adapting, I gripped even harder. I ignored the signs, refused to see the cracks forming, convinced that if I just tried a little more, things would fall back into place. But they didn't. One evening, I found myself at the shore, walking aimlessly as the waves lapped at my feet. The sky was painted in soft pastels, the kind of colors that only appear when the world is preparing to rest. I reached down and scooped up a handful of sand. As I lifted it, I tightened my fingers around it, and slowly, grain by grain, the sand slipped through the gaps. No matter how hard I held on, it trickled away, carried back to the earth by forces far greater than my grasp. Then I loosened my grip. The remaining sand settled naturally in my palm, resting there effortlessly. And just like that, something in me shifted. I had spent so long gripping onto things that were already leaving, relationships, expectations, even parts of myself that I had outgrown, fighting against the natural flow of life. But maybe, just maybe, peace wasn't about holding on. Maybe it was about letting go. Buddhism teaches that attachment is the root of suffering. And yet, we attach ourselves to so much material things, people, identities, even the idea of who we think we should be. We convince ourselves that if we just have this person, this job, this version of success, then we will be happy. But happiness doesn't work that way. It isn't something we trap and keep forever. It's something that flows when we stop grasping for it. I remember a story I once heard about a man who lived his entire life in pursuit of wealth. No matter how much he gained, it was never enough. He wanted more. More security, more possessions, more power. But the more he chased, the more elusive true contentment became. One day, an old monk asked him to imagine that he was drowning in a river. "What would you do?" the monk asked. "I'd struggle to stay afloat," the man replied. "And if there were a heavy stone in your hand, I'd have to let it go," the man admitted. The monk smiled. "Then why do you insist on drowning in life while refusing to let go of the weight you carry?" For a long time, I carried my own stones, resentment, expectations, the idea that things had to go a certain way. But holding on to something tightly doesn't make it stay. In fact, sometimes it pushes it further away. Letting go isn't about giving up. It's about understanding that some things are not meant to be forced. That peace isn't found in clenching our fists around what we fear to lose, but in opening our hands and trusting that whatever remains is what was always meant to be. I still catch myself gripping too tightly sometimes. Old habits don't disappear overnight, But now, when I feel that familiar tightness in my chest, the desperate urge to control what is slipping away, I remind myself of the sand. I take a breath, open my hands, and let it be. And in that space, in that surrender, I find something unexpected: freedom. I used to think happiness was something I had to chase, that if I just worked a little harder, achieved a little more, or reached the next milestone, then I would finally feel it, settled, fulfilled, complete. But the truth is, no matter how much I gained, there was always something missing. It was as if I was carrying a bucket with a small hole in the bottom. No matter how much I poured into it, it never seemed to fill. Then one evening, quite unexpectedly, I stumbled upon the simplest remedy. It wasn't a grand revelation, nor was it a sudden moment of enlightenment. It happened while I was sitting on my porch, a cup of tea warming my hands, watching the sky shift from blue to gold as the sun melted into the horizon. A thought came to me, quiet but persistent. This is enough. Not the kind of enough that feels like settling, but the kind that wraps around you like a soft blanket on a chilly night. The kind that says, right here, right now, you have everything you need. It's funny how easily we overlook the things we already have. Our minds are wired to scan for what's missing, what's wrong, what could be better. We scroll through pictures of people who seem happier, wealthier, more successful. We compare, we crave, and in doing so, we blind ourselves to the quiet abundance already surrounding us. I once heard a story about a man who lived in a small village. He was always dissatisfied, always searching for something more. One day, he traveled to visit a wise teacher, hoping for guidance. "Master," he said, "I have worked hard, yet I feel like I have nothing. What should I do?" The teacher handed him a piece of parchment and a brush. "Tonight, before you sleep," he said, "write down 3 things you are grateful for. Do this every night for a month, and then return to me." The man was skeptical but followed the instructions. At first, he struggled. His mind kept returning to his frustrations, his desires, the things he had not yet accomplished. But slowly, something shifted. One night, he wrote, "I am grateful for the sound of rain on the roof." Another night, for my wife's laughter at dinner. Then, for the warmth of my morning tea. Small things, everyday things, things he had never really noticed before. By the time he returned to the teacher, he no longer needed to ask the question. He had found his answer. The life he had once seen as lacking was now overflowing. Not because it had changed, but because he had. I used to think gratitude was something reserved for grand moments, celebrations, promotions, the big things we mark on our calendars. But it's not. It's in the details, the pauses, the tiny joys tucked into ordinary days. It's in the way sunlight spills through the window in the morning, the way a friend remembers your favorite song, the way the first sip of coffee feels on a sleepy afternoon. Gratitude doesn't erase difficulties. It doesn't mean pretending life is perfect. It simply shifts the focus from what's missing to what's present. And when we make a habit of looking for these small gifts, something remarkable happens. We find more of them. I started keeping a gratitude journal just like the man in the story. At first, it felt forced, like another task on my endless to-do list. But soon, I noticed how it changed me. Instead of waking up and immediately thinking about what needed to be fixed, I began looking for what was already whole. Try it. Tonight, before you sleep, write down 3 things. A warm meal, kind word, a moment of laughter. Over time, you'll start to see life differently. You'll start to feel it, this quiet, steady hum of enoughness. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize that happiness was never something to chase. It was something waiting to be noticed all along. I used to think meditation was something only monks did, something for people who lived in mountain temples, untouched by the rush and noise of the real world. It was something distant, abstract, maybe even a little intimidating. My mind was too busy, too loud. How could I possibly sit in silence and do nothing? Then, one morning, I found myself sitting on a wooden bench in a quiet garden, listening to the sound of rustling bamboo. It had rained the night before, and the scent of wet earth clung to the air. A monk, old and serene, sat a few steps away, his eyes half closed in meditation. I watched him for a while, wondering what it was like to be so still, so unmoved by the passing of time. He must have sensed my gaze because, after a while, he opened his eyes and smiled. "Your mind is restless," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. I laughed nervously. "Always," I admitted. He nodded, as if he had seen 1,000 minds just like mine. "Come," he said, patting the space next to him. "Sit." I hesitated. "I don't think I'm very good at meditating." His smile deepened. "That is like saying you are not good at breathing. You do not have to be good at it. You just do it." I sighed but sat down anyway. The bench was cool against my skin. The air, thick with the scent of moss and rain, felt alive. The monk closed his eyes again, and after a moment, I did too. "Listen," he said, "not with your ears, but with your whole being." I tried. At first, all I could hear was the chatter in my own head, a constant stream of thoughts tumbling over one another, like waves crashing on a shore. Did I remember to answer that email? What should I eat for lunch? I wonder if meditation will actually help me? The monk's voice interrupted my spiral. "Do not fight your thoughts," he said. "Let them rise, let them fall, like clouds passing in the sky." I took a breath, and then another. The sky of my mind was stormy, full of shifting clouds, but I tried not to grasp at them. I just sat. I listened. First, nothing happened. But then, slowly, gently, I began to notice the spaces between the thoughts, the brief pauses, the quiet. I felt my shoulders relax, my breath slow. I was still thinking, of course, but I wasn't lost in it. I was watching it, as if from a slight distance, like a traveler pausing on the side of the road to observe the passing scenery. After what felt like minutes but could have been an hour, the monk spoke again. "Do you feel it?" he asked. I opened my eyes, surprised at the sense of calm that had settled over me. "Feel what?" I asked. He chuckled. "The stillness. It has always been there. You just had to stop long enough to notice it." I didn't say anything, but I knew he was right. I used to think meditation was about emptying the mind, about achieving some perfect state of silence. But it's not. It's about making space. It's about stepping out of the constant motion of thoughts and realizing that beneath it all, there is something steady, something quiet, something always present. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." And I think that's what meditation is. It's not about escaping life, but about learning to be fully present within it. After that day, I made meditation a habit, not because I was good at it, but because I had finally understood what it was for. It wasn't about doing nothing. It was about remembering something, that underneath all the noise, the rushing, the worrying, there is a stillness we can return to, a home within ourselves. Now, each morning before the world wakes up, I sit. I close my eyes. I listen. And in that quiet space between thoughts, I find myself again. There was a time in my life when I thought peace was something I had to earn. That if I pushed myself hard enough, worked more, sacrificed more, achieved more, then maybe, just maybe, I would finally reach some mythical state of balance. But balance doesn't work that way. You don't find it at the end of an exhausting journey, waiting like a prize. You find it in the way you walk the path itself. I learned this lesson, not from books, not even from the wisdom of others, but from my own exhaustion. There was a period when I was caught in the grip of extremes, swinging wildly between discipline and indulgence, between overworking and burnout, between deep solitude and desperate socializing. I would starve myself of rest, then collapse into days of doing nothing. I would push my body too hard, then resent it for not keeping up. I would chase productivity like a starving man, only to find myself empty at the end of each day. One morning, after an especially restless night, I found myself at a small temple on the outskirts of town. I hadn't planned to go there, but something in me was seeking stillness. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and a few monks moved quietly through the courtyard, their robes whispering against the stone floor. I watched as one of the younger monks struggled to carry 2 buckets of water from the well. He had filled them to the brim, and as he walked, water sloshed over the edges, drenching his robe. An older monk, watching from nearby, approached him with a gentle smile. "You carry too much," he said simply. The young monk frowned. "But I must bring enough water." The older monk nodded. "Yes, but if you carry too much, you spill what is precious before you even arrive." The younger monk looked down at the buckets, watching as the water continued to spill with each unsteady step. The older monk continued. "If you had filled them only halfway, you would have reached your destination without losing so much." Something in his words struck me. I had been carrying my own buckets too full of expectations, of responsibilities, of relentless self-judgment. And in doing so, I had lost so much along the way. My energy, my peace, my ability to simply be. I thought about Siddhartha before he became the Buddha, how he had once lived in a palace of excess, surrounded by every pleasure imaginable, yet still felt empty, and how he had then swung to the opposite extreme, starving himself, denying every earthly comfort, pushing his body to its breaking point in search of enlightenment. But it was only when he abandoned both extremes that he found the truth, the middle way. Neither indulgence nor deprivation, neither excess nor absence, only balance. I had been telling myself that peace was something I would find later, when I had done enough. But the middle way teaches something different. Peace is found in how we live, not in what we achieve. That day at the temple, I sat for a long time beneath an old fig tree, feeling the weight of my own extremes. And I asked myself, where am I carrying too much? Where am I emptying myself before I even arrive? I started making small changes. I stopped treating rest as something I had to deserve. I let myself work hard without pushing to the point of exhaustion. I allowed moments of joy without guilt. I embraced the quiet in between the noise. And slowly, I felt something shift. The wild pendulum that had been swinging inside me for so long began to settle. The Buddha once said, "The middle way is the path to peace." And I have found this to be true, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a lived experience. So if you find yourself caught in extremes, ask yourself, where am I spilling my own water? How can I carry my burdens with more balance? And then, like a traveler adjusting their steps on a winding road, find your own middle way. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of this journey, but in truth, the journey never really ends. Every breath, every step, every moment is an opportunity to begin again. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: peace is not a destination, but a way of walking through life. It's in how we embrace the present, how we let go, how we soften our grip on things that do not serve us. Take a moment now. Close your eyes if you wish. Feel the breath moving in and out of your body. This is your home. This stillness has always been here, waiting for you to return. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to share your reflections in the comments below. What spoke to you the most? What lesson are you taking with you today? Your thoughts may be the guiding light for someone else walking this path. And if you wish to continue exploring these teachings together, consider subscribing to Lotus Light Teachings. This is more than just a channel. It's a space for wisdom, reflection, and gentle reminders to live fully, deeply, and peacefully. Until next time, may you walk your path with grace, may your heart be light, and may you always remember, the lotus blooms not by reaching, but by simply being. Be well, be present, be free. Namaste, dear friends. Take a deep breath. Let the weight of the day soften, if only for a moment. Have you ever felt like you're doing everything right, working hard, following the path you were told would lead to happiness? Yet something still feels missing, like a quiet emptiness beneath all the noise of daily life? We spend so much time searching outside ourselves, chasing success, approval, security, believing that just one more achievement, one more thing will finally bring peace. But what if true peace has never been something to find, but something to uncover? Buddha once said, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." And yet we carry habits, subtle, persistent, that keep us stuck in suffering, habits we may not even recognize. Today, we'll explore 10 of these hidden burdens and the art of letting go. And here's a secret. There's something at number 5 that may just shift the way you see your past forever. So stay with me until the end. If these teachings resonate with you, if you've ever longed for a deeper sense of calm, I invite you to join this journey. Let's not just learn wisdom, let's live it. Subscribe, and together, let's uncover the path back to ourselves. Now let's begin. I used to think that if I could just make everyone happy, life would be smooth. No conflicts, no disappointments, just harmony. I said yes when I meant no, smiled when I was exhausted, and apologized when I had nothing to apologize for. It worked, at least for a while. People liked me, but over time something strange happened. I started feeling hollow, like I was fading into the background of my own life. It was as if I had become a supporting character in everyone else's story, but never the main character in my own. One evening, I found myself sitting in a quiet temple courtyard, watching the way the lanterns flickered in the soft wind. A monk, an old friend of mine, sat down beside me. We didn't speak for a while, just listened to the rustling of leaves. Finally, he asked, "Why do you look so tired?" I let out a long sigh. "I just want to do the right thing," I said. "I try to be kind, to be helpful, to make people happy, but it never feels like enough. No matter what I do, someone is always upset, and I don't know how to stop caring." He chuckled. A warm, understanding laugh, the kind that makes you feel like your struggle is both seen and gently smiled upon. "Have you ever heard the story of the father, the son, and the donkey?" I nodded vaguely, but he told it anyway, his voice slow and rhythmic, like water flowing over smooth stones. A father and son were traveling with their donkey. At first, the son rode while the father walked, and people whispered, "What a selfish child, letting his poor father suffer." So they switched, now the father rode while the son walked. "What a cruel old man," people muttered. "How could he let his young boy struggle like that?" So then both of them rode the donkey. "Look at those greedy fools," people scoffed. "That poor donkey." So finally they both walked beside the donkey, carrying their own weight. And of course people laughed. "What idiots! They have a donkey but won't even use it." The monk turned to me, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "You see, no matter what you do, someone will always have something to say." I laughed too, but a lump was forming in my throat. I realized how much of my life I had spent trying to be the right version of myself for everyone else. If I was too quiet, people called me distant. If I spoke my mind, they said I was too opinionated. If I worked hard, they said I should relax. If I took a break, they said I was lazy. I had spent so much time twisting myself into shapes that fit other people's expectations that I had forgotten my own. The monk's voice softened. The question isn't, how can I make everyone happy? But rather, how can I live in alignment with my own values? Because the truth is, trying to please everyone is like trying to hold water in your hands. It will always slip through your fingers. That night, I sat with those words for a long time. The lanterns flickered, the leaves whispered, and deep inside, something in me began to shift. I thought about all the times I had said yes when I meant no. All the times I had swallowed my own needs just to keep the peace. And I realized something. Peace isn't found in making everyone else happy. Peace is found in being true to yourself. Of course, that doesn't mean being unkind or ignoring the feelings of others. Compassion is still important, but true compassion includes yourself. When you constantly sacrifice your own well-being just to avoid disappointing people, you aren't practicing kindness, you're practicing self-abandonment. The next day, I tried something different. I set a small boundary. Nothing big, just a simple, "I can't today," when I was asked to take on yet another favor I didn't have the energy for. And you know what? The world didn't end. No one hated me. In fact, the person simply nodded and said, "No problem." I had spent years fearing reactions that never even came. I started practicing the art of gentle refusal. At first, it felt strange, like I was doing something wrong. But over time, I realized that the people who truly valued me understood. And those who only valued what I could do for them, well, their disappointment was never mine to carry in the first place. If you've ever felt the weight of trying to be everything for everyone, I want you to ask yourself this. Who are you when no one else is watching? Who are you when you aren't performing for approval? That person. The one who breathes deeply in quiet moments, who feels joy in the simplest of things, who has thoughts and desires and dreams beyond what others expect. That is your true self. And that is the self you deserve to honor. There will always be critics. There will always be people who think you should be doing more or less or different. But at the end of the day, the only person who has to live with your choices is you. So be kind, be generous, be compassionate, but don't lose yourself in the process. And if you ever find yourself feeling guilty for choosing what's right for you, just remember the Father, the Son, and the donkey. No matter what you do, people will always talk. The question is, whose voice will you listen to? Theirs or your own? There was a time when my mind felt like a crowded marketplace. Noisy, chaotic, full of voices calling out for my attention. I would lie awake at night, replaying conversations from years ago, wondering if I had said the wrong thing, if I had been misunderstood. I'd obsess over decisions I hadn't even made yet, turning them over like a stone in my hand, searching for cracks. It was exhausting. It was endless. One evening, after yet another restless night, I found myself walking through a quiet garden in a temple. The air smelled of fresh earth and jasmine, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I sat on a worn wooden bench beneath an old banyan tree, feeling the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me. An elderly monk happened to pass by and paused when he saw me. He had a face that reminded me of a still lake, calm, deep, unmoved by ripples. "Your mind is busy," he said with a small smile. I let out a heavy sigh. I just can't stop thinking about everything. Things that happened, things that might happen. It's like my brain refuses to be quiet. The monk nodded as if he had heard this 1,000 times before. He sat down next to me and gestured toward a small stream nearby. "Tell me," he said, "if you throw a handful of sand into that water, what happens?" I glanced at the stream, the water clear and steady. "It'll stir up the sand for a bit, but eventually it'll settle." He smiled. "Exactly. And what if you keep stirring it?" I saw where this was going. "Then it'll never settle. The water will stay murky." He nodded again. "Your mind is the same. Every time you go back to a thought, every time you overanalyze or worry, you are stirring up the sand. The more you stir, the cloudier things become. But if you just let the water be, it clears on its own." I sat with that idea for a while, watching the way the water moved around the rocks, flowing effortlessly, never trying to hold on to any one moment. It was such a simple truth, and yet I had spent years resisting it. We humans have a strange habit of believing that worrying will somehow protect us. That if we just think hard enough, prepare enough, analyze enough, we can prevent bad things from happening. But life doesn't work that way. The past is already written, and the future is not ours to control. The only thing we ever truly have is this moment, right now. I thought back to all the times I had worried about things that never happened. The conversations I had rehearsed in my head, only to find that the actual discussion was nothing like I had imagined. The sleepless nights spent dreading outcomes that never came to pass. How much time had I wasted? How much peace had I traded for illusions? The monk's voice was gentle but firm. The mind's nature is to think, just as the river's nature is to flow. But you are not your thoughts, just as the river is not the sand it carries. You don't have to hold on to every thought that passes through your mind. Let them come and let them go. I wanted to believe that, but I wasn't sure how. "But what if I can't stop?" I asked. He chuckled. "You don't have to stop. You only have to observe. Imagine sitting by the riverbank watching the water pass by. Some thoughts will be gentle ripples, some will be crashing waves. But if you sit still and simply watch, you will see that none of them stay forever. That night, I tried something different. Instead of fighting my thoughts, I watched them. When my mind brought up an embarrassing memory from years ago, I noticed it, nodded at it like an old acquaintance, and let it pass. When worry about the future crept in, I asked myself, can I control this? If not, I'll let it go. I won't say it was easy. The habit of overthinking had been with me for years, and it didn't loosen its grip overnight. But the more I practiced, the lighter I felt. The present moment, once a fleeting thing I barely noticed, became something I cherished. The simple joy of feeling the sun on my face. The sound of laughter in the distance. The quiet peace of breathing, just breathing, without needing to fix or solve anything. There's a saying in Buddhism, when you're in the past, you're living in memories. When you're in the future, you're living in imagination. But when you're in the present, you are truly alive. I think about that often now. When my mind starts to spin, when the urge to analyze every little thing creeps in, I remind myself, I don't have to stir the water. I don't have to hold on. I can simply be, and you can too. There was a time when I measured my life against everyone else's. I don't know exactly when it started, maybe in school when grades were compared, or later when careers, relationships, even happiness seemed to be some sort of quiet competition. I would scroll through my phone late at night, seeing people's perfectly curated lives. Their successes, their travels, their seemingly effortless joy, and wonder, why not me? It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was something softer but heavier. A dull ache that whispered, you should be further along by now. One day, during a particularly restless afternoon, I found myself visiting an old temple outside the city. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, where the air smelled of incense and rain-soaked earth. I wandered into the garden, a quiet space filled with stone pathways and lotus ponds, and found a familiar figure sitting cross-legged beneath a willow tree. The monk, an old friend, looked up as I approached. "Ah," he said, smiling, "you've brought company today." I looked around, confused. "It's just me," he chuckled. "Are you sure? Your mind seems quite crowded." I laughed, but he wasn't wrong. My thoughts had been a tangled mess of comparisons. Friends buying houses, colleagues getting promotions, strangers on the internet living picture-perfect lives. I sat down beside him, the ground cool beneath my hands. "I don't know why I do it," I admitted. "I know I shouldn't compare myself to others, but it's like, I can't help it. Everyone seems so ahead, and I feel like I'm always behind." The monk picked up a small stone and tossed it into the pond. Ripples spread outward, distorting the reflection of the sky. "Do you know the story of the 2 lotus flowers?" he asked. I shook my head, so he began. "Once, in a pond much like this one, 2 lotus seeds lay buried beneath the mud. The first seed sprouted quickly, pushing through the dark waters toward the sunlight. It bloomed early, its petals stretching toward the sky. The second seed took longer. It hesitated, unsure, growing at its own pace. When it finally reached the surface, the first lotus had already been blooming for weeks. The second lotus looked around and thought, I am late. I should have bloomed sooner. But the wind whispered, you are not late. You are exactly where you need to be. And when the second lotus finally opened, it was just as beautiful as the first. The monk smiled at me. Now, tell me, was the second lotus any less beautiful for blooming later? I thought about it. No, it was just different. He nodded. Different, but not less. Each flower blooms in its own time, just as each person does. But the world will try to convince you otherwise. It will show you the first lotus and say, look how fast it grew. You must keep up. It will make you believe that your path should look like someone else's. But the truth is, the sun shines on every flower in its own time. I sat with that for a while, listening to the rustling leaves. The thought of being a second lotus, blooming later but still blooming, felt like a small weight lifting from my chest. But it's hard, I admitted, especially now with social media. It's like everywhere I look, someone is doing better than me. It's hard not to compare. The monk chuckled. You remind me of a dog I once knew. I raised an eyebrow. A dog? Yes, he said. A little brown dog that used to live near the temple. He was well-fed, well-loved, and had plenty of space to run. But one day, he saw another dog with a bone, and suddenly, his own food wasn't enough. He wanted that bone, so he chased the other dog, barking, trying to take it. In his excitement, he ran over a bridge and saw his reflection in the water. He thought it was another dog with an even bigger bone. So, of course, he lunged for it. And in doing so, he dropped his own bone into the river. I couldn't help but laugh. That sounds about right. The monk grinned. Comparison is like that. You can be perfectly content, but the moment you look at someone else's life, you start feeling like yours isn't enough. You chase an illusion, and in the process, you lose sight of what you already have. I exhaled slowly. I had spent so much time looking sideways, at other people, at their timelines, at what I thought I should have accomplished by now, that I hadn't really been looking at my own life, the things I had built, the ways I had grown. True happiness, the monk continued, comes not from measuring yourself against others, but from appreciating what is yours. In Buddhism, we call this mudita, sympathetic joy. It means being genuinely happy for others, not because their success diminishes yours, but because their joy is a reminder that happiness is possible. When you stop competing, you start celebrating. And when you start celebrating, you free yourself. The garden was quiet except for the gentle sound of water lapping at the edges of the pond. A single lotus, half closed, floated near the surface, waiting for the right moment to bloom. I thought about all the times I had let comparison steal my peace. All the moments I had spent chasing someone else's version of success, instead of appreciating my own journey. I wasn't behind. I wasn't late. I was simply growing at my own pace. As I stood to leave, the monk added one last thing. The next time you feel the urge to compare, ask yourself, am I admiring or am I measuring? Admiration can inspire, but measuring only takes away. That evening, as I walked home, I felt something shift. The world didn't look different, but I saw it differently. The pressure, the self-doubt, the feeling of being behind. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it was quieter. And when I passed a small flower on the side of the road, just beginning to open its petals, I smiled. It wasn't early. It wasn't late. It was simply blooming, just like me. I used to think that failure was something to be avoided at all costs. The thought of making a mistake, of falling short, of disappointing others, it felt unbearable. So I hesitated. I overthought. I played it safe. And without even realizing it, I built a life that was small. Not because I lacked dreams, but because I feared what might happen if I dared to chase them. One evening, I found myself at a temple nestled in the hills, the kind of place where silence felt like an old friend. The sky had turned shades of amber and violet, and the scent of burning incense curled into the cool air. I had come seeking answers, though I wasn't sure what the right question was. An old monk sat on the stone steps, watching the last light of the day slip behind the mountains. Without looking at me, he said, "You seem troubled." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I want to do something," I admitted. "Something that matters to me, but I keep thinking, what if I fail?" He nodded as if he had heard these words before. Perhaps from many people, perhaps even from himself, once. "Come with me," he said, rising to his feet. I followed him past the temple garden, where lotus flowers rested on the surface of a still pond, their petals just beginning to close for the night. We stopped at a small wooden hut, and from inside, he pulled out a delicate ceramic bowl, the kind that looked as if even the gentlest wind could shatter it. "Take this," he said, placing it in my hands, "and carry it across the rocky path to the other side of the courtyard." I stared at the bowl, then at the uneven stones beneath my feet. "What if I drop it?" He smiled. "Then you will have learned something." I hesitated but took the first step. The bowl felt impossibly fragile in my hands. With every movement, I imagined it slipping, falling, breaking into a dozen irreparable pieces. My fingers gripped it tighter. My steps became hesitant. I focused so much on not failing that my body stiffened. My breath caught in my chest. And then, just as I had feared, it happened. My foot caught on a loose stone, and before I could catch myself, the bowl tumbled from my hands and shattered at my feet. Silence. I braced for disappointment, for reproach. But the monk simply chuckled, his laughter as light as the evening breeze. "That," he said, "is exactly why you are stuck." I looked at him, confused. "You were so afraid of breaking the bowl that you forgot how to walk," he explained. "You focused so much on failure that you created it." "Do you see? I did. And yet, the lesson was one my heart struggled to accept." He crouched down and picked up one of the larger pieces of the broken bowl. "Tell me, does this mean you will never try again?" I shook my head. "Good." He placed the broken piece back on the ground. "Because you will fail again, and again, and again. And if you are wise, you will let each failure teach you instead of stop you." We walked back to the pond, the moon now reflecting softly in the water. The monk gestured to the lotus flowers. "Do you know how they grow?" he asked. I had read about it before. "They start in the mud," I said. "They push through the dark waters before they reach the surface." "Exactly," he nodded. "The mud is necessary. Without it, there is no lotus. And yet, we humans spend our lives avoiding the mud, afraid to get our hands dirty, afraid to fail. But it is only by embracing the mud, our struggles, our mistakes, our missteps, that we ever bloom." The words sank in like rain soaking into dry earth. I thought about all the times I had let fear stop me before I even began. The job I didn't apply for because I wasn't sure I was good enough. The dream I put on hold because I was afraid of judgment. The words I left unsaid because I feared they wouldn't be perfect. How much of my life had I already lost to fear? I looked back at the pond, at the lotus blossoms floating effortlessly on the surface, never questioning whether they were worthy of blooming. I wanted to be like that. "But what if I fail again?" I asked. The monk smiled. "Then you will get up, and you will try again, because failure is not the opposite of success. It is part of it." As I walked away from the temple that night, I felt lighter. The fear was still there, lingering in the corners of my mind, but it no longer controlled me. I knew now that failure wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. And so, I took my next step, not with hesitation, but with confidence. Not in spite of the possibility of failure, but because of it. After all, no lotus blooms without first pushing through the mud. I used to think the past was something I had to hold on to. Like a book I had read 1,000 times. I would flip through its pages, lingering on old regrets, replaying mistakes, wondering how different things could have been if only I had chosen another path. There was one memory in particular that clung to me. It was years ago, but still, on quiet nights, it would sneak up on me, wrapping itself around my mind like ivy on an old stone wall. I'd be doing something ordinary, washing dishes, walking home, sitting alone with a cup of tea, and suddenly, there it was. The things I said, the things I didn't say, the way it all unfolded. The ache of wishing I could go back and do it differently. One evening, as I was lost in this familiar loop of thoughts, I found myself wandering toward a small monastery on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where the air smelled of incense and rain-soaked earth, where the sound of the wind moving through the trees felt like a whisper from something older and wiser than me. A monk, someone I had spoken with before, sat on the temple steps, drinking tea. He saw me approaching and simply gestured for me to sit. No words, no questions, just space. After a long silence, I finally spoke. "I can't seem to let go of the past," I admitted, staring down at the stone ground. "I keep replaying things that already happened, things I can't change. It's like my mind refuses to move forward." The monk set his cup down and smiled. "You remind me of the two monks at the river," he said. I looked up, curious. "What story is that?" He began in the soft, steady rhythm of someone who has told a story many times. Two monks were traveling together when they came to a riverbank. A woman stood there, unable to cross. She asked for help. Now, monks were not supposed to touch women, but one of them, without hesitation, lifted her up, carried her across the river, and set her down on the other side. Then they continued on their journey. Hours passed. The second monk, who had been silent the whole time, finally burst out, "How could you do that? We are not supposed to touch women." The first monk simply smiled and replied, "I put her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" I sat with that story for a moment, letting its meaning settle into my bones. The monk beside me picked up his cup again. "You see," he said, taking a slow sip, "we all carry things long after we should have put them down. Not just memories, but anger, guilt, resentment, regret. The past is already gone, yet we keep carrying it, like a heavy stone in our pockets." I nodded, feeling the weight of my own stone pressing against me. "But how do I put it down?" The monk smiled again, setting his cup aside. "First, you must see that you are the one holding it. The past is not clinging to you, you are clinging to it." That realization landed like a quiet bell ringing in my chest. I had always thought the past was something that had a grip on me, but maybe I was the one gripping it. I exhaled slowly. "But what if I don't know how to let go?" The monk gestured toward the trees. "Do you see how the leaves let go in autumn? They don't ask, 'Should I fall now?' They don't argue with the wind. They simply release because that is their nature. And when they do, the tree does not mourn them. It knows that letting go is part of growth." I looked at the branches, the golden leaves drifting softly to the ground. The tree did not cling. The tree did not regret. It simply accepted the seasons. I thought about all the ways I had been trying to rewrite the past in my mind, all the ways I had fought against what was already done. And what had it ever given me? Nothing but pain. Letting go, I realized, was not about forgetting. It was about freeing myself from the control of what was already gone. I turned back to the monk. "So what do I do now?" He chuckled, as if the answer was the simplest thing in the world. "You live." And so I tried. I won't say that I suddenly woke up the next day and felt free. Letting go is not always a single moment. It's a practice. Sometimes my mind still reached for those old memories. Sometimes I still found myself carrying them. But each time I did, I reminded myself, I put this down already. I do not need to carry it anymore. Little by little, the weight became lighter. The pages of the past stopped calling my name. I began to notice the present more. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of laughter in the distance, the feeling of my own breath, steady and real. One evening, months later, I walked past the monastery again. The monk was there, as usual, sipping his tea. He looked at me, as if searching for the weight I once carried. "You seem lighter," he said. I smiled, feeling the truth of it. "I finally put it down." He nodded, as if that was the only answer there ever needed to be. And just like that, the wind carried another leaf from the tree, and I did not reach to catch it. I used to tell myself, "I'll do it tomorrow." It was such a small, innocent thought. Just a little delay. Nothing urgent. Tomorrow always felt like a safer place. A fresh start where I would magically become more disciplined, more motivated, more ready. But tomorrow came and the same cycle repeated. I would sit down to work, and suddenly my mind would whisper, "Maybe you should clean your desk first. Maybe you should make tea. Maybe you should check your phone, just for a moment." Hours would pass, and at the end of the day, the task I had meant to start was still untouched, buried beneath a pile of distractions. It wasn't until I met an old monk that I truly understood what I was doing to myself. It was during a visit to a quiet monastery in the hills. I had come looking for clarity, hoping to find some wisdom that would shake me out of my own habits. The monk, a man with kind eyes and a face like the still surface of a lake, listened as I told him about my struggles with procrastination. He smiled and said, "Come with me." I followed him to a small garden, where a massive stone sat in the middle of a dirt path. "Try to move it," he said. I hesitated, but I leaned down and pushed against the stone. It didn't budge. He nodded. Now try again. But this time, don't push the whole stone. Just move it an inch. I frowned but obeyed. Instead of using all my strength at once, I pressed against it little by little. And to my surprise, the stone shifted just slightly, but enough to prove it could be moved. The monk chuckled. You see, the hardest part is starting. But once you create movement, even the heaviest stone can be moved over time. I let that sink in. I had spent so much of my life overwhelmed by the size of my tasks, convincing myself that unless I could do everything perfectly, I shouldn't even start. I had built up the idea of effort in my mind until it felt impossible. But the truth was, I didn't need to move the whole stone at once. I just needed to nudge it forward. Procrastination is not laziness, the monk continued. It is fear. Fear of failure, fear of discomfort, fear of not being good enough. So we delay, hoping the fear will fade. But fear does not fade with time. It fades with action. I thought about all the times I had put things off. Not because I wasn't capable, but because deep down I was afraid. Afraid of writing something that wasn't perfect. Afraid of making mistakes. Afraid of facing something hard. The monk must have seen the realization on my face because he smiled and handed me a small rake. Start here, he said, pointing to a patch of unkempt dirt. Just one stroke. I dragged the rake across the earth. A small, simple motion. Good, he said. Now another. And just like that, the garden began to take shape. That night, as I sat in my room at the monastery, I thought about how often I had let perfectionism paralyze me. How often I had waited for the right moment, as if motivation was something that would magically appear one day and carry me forward. But it never worked that way. The next morning, before I could think too much about it, I sat down and wrote. Not well, not perfectly, but I wrote. Just a sentence at first, then another. And soon the words were flowing. The stone had moved. Since that day, I've learned a few things about procrastination. First, waiting to feel ready is an illusion. The mind always finds reasons to delay, always whispers, not now, maybe later. But later is a trick of the mind. The only time that truly exists is now. Second, small steps create momentum. Just 5 minutes. Just one sentence. Just a single action. Once you begin, your brain shifts from resistance to progress. And suddenly, what felt impossible becomes doable. And third, discomfort is temporary. The moment before you start is the hardest. But once you push through it, you realize the fear of effort is always worse than the effort itself. Now, when I find myself hesitating, I remember the stone in the garden. I remind myself that I don't need to move everything at once. I just need to push even a little. And most importantly, I ask myself, if not now, when? Because tomorrow is just another today, waiting to be lived. I used to think that taking care of myself meant getting things done. Checking off to-do lists, staying busy, keeping up with everything and everyone. If I was exhausted, it meant I was productive. If I skipped meals or slept too little, it meant I was working hard. I wore stress like a badge of honor, as if the more I neglected my own well-being, the more valuable I became. It wasn't until my body forced me to stop that I realized something was deeply wrong. One winter, after weeks of long nights and endless deadlines, I found myself in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to move. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper, a heaviness that settled into my bones, a fog that clouded my thoughts. My body ached in ways I couldn't explain. My mind was restless yet drained, and no amount of caffeine or motivation could pull me out of it. I remember lying there, thinking, I don't have time for this, as if my own well-being was an inconvenience. At some point during that week, a friend suggested I visit a small Buddhist retreat not far from the city. I resisted at first. There were too many things to do, and I couldn't afford to just disappear for a few days. But the truth was, I didn't have the energy to argue. So I went. The monastery sat nestled in the mountains, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. The moment I arrived, something in me exhaled. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that made you realize how much noise you had been carrying inside yourself. An elderly monk greeted me at the entrance. He had kind eyes, the kind that seemed to see through you, past all the layers of exhaustion and into the parts of you that you had forgotten. "You look tired," he said simply. I laughed, though it came out more like a sigh. "I am," I admitted. He gestured for me to follow him. We walked through the monastery gardens, past rows of blooming camellias and a small pond where koi fish swam lazily beneath the water's surface. After a while, he stopped and pointed at a large clay jar sitting beneath a tree. It had a small crack running along its side, a thin fracture that split its surface but didn't break it entirely. "Do you know what happens when a jar is left empty for too long?" he asked. I shook my head. "It dries out," he said. "The clay becomes brittle. Even the smallest crack can shatter it." He turned to look at me. "And do you know what happens when a mind and body are neglected for too long?" I looked away. I already knew the answer. He smiled gently. "Come, let me show you something." We walked to a shaded pavilion where a group of monks were stretching slow, deliberate movements, almost like a dance. One of them, a young woman, noticed my curiosity and waved me over. "Join us," she said. I hesitated. "I don't really do this kind of thing." "Neither do we," she laughed. "But our bodies do." So I followed their lead. The movements were simple, lifting an arm, stretching a leg, rolling the shoulders. But with each motion, I felt something shift inside me. A loosening, a softening. I hadn't realized how tense I had been, how tightly I had been holding myself together. Afterward, we sat in silence, just breathing. The old monk joined us again, settling onto the wooden floor beside me. "You see," he said, "we spend so much time in our heads, thinking, planning, worrying, that we forget we even have bodies. And yet, our body carries us through this life. It moves us, holds us, heals us. How often do we thank it?" I had never thought about it that way before. My body had been with me through everything. Every late night, every moment of stress, every unkind word I had whispered to myself. And yet, I had treated it as something secondary, something that existed only to serve my ambitions. "Your mind and body are not separate," the monk continued. "Neglect one and the other suffers. Care for one and the other heals." For the first time in a long time, I listened. Over the next few days, I let myself slow down. I took long walks through the gardens, feeling the ground beneath my feet. I ate meals without distraction, tasting each bite instead of rushing through them. I slept deep, uninterrupted sleep, the kind that feels like being cradled by the universe itself. And I meditated not to achieve anything, but simply to be. By the time I left, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't fixed. I still had work to do, habits to unlearn. But I had begun to understand something I hadn't before. Self-care isn't indulgence. It isn't selfish. It's not something you earn after you've exhausted yourself. It's survival. It's waking up and choosing every day to be kind to yourself. To move your body not to change it, but to thank it. To feed your mind not with stress and distractions, but with things that nourish it. Books, laughter, stillness, real conversations. To rest not because you've finished everything, but because you are worthy of rest no matter what. And most of all, it's understanding that you cannot pour from an empty cup. I still have days when I forget. Days when I fall back into old patterns, when I push too hard, when I neglect myself in the name of being productive. But now I notice it sooner. I catch myself before I reach the breaking point. And when I do, I return to what I learned in that quiet monastery garden. I stretch, I breathe, I slow down, and little by little I fill my cup again. I used to think that if I could just make everyone happy, if I could meet their expectations, impress them, earn their approval, then I would finally feel like I was enough. If people liked me, I felt valuable. If they didn't notice me, if they disapproved or judged, I felt small, invisible, unworthy. I didn't realize then that I was living in a cage. One built not of walls, but of opinions. The funny thing is, I wasn't even sure whose approval I was chasing. Was it my family? My friends? Strangers on the internet? Sometimes, it felt like I was performing for a faceless audience, always waiting for applause that never quite filled the emptiness inside me. One evening, I found myself scrolling endlessly on my phone, lost in a sea of perfect lives. People smiling, achieving, traveling, looking as if they had it all figured out. And there I was, comparing, doubting, questioning myself. I caught my own reflection in the dim glow of the screen, and for a brief moment, I saw myself not as a person, but as someone trying to be someone else. It hit me like a quiet truth I had been avoiding. I was letting other people decide my worth. I needed a break. That weekend, I drove to a small monastery I had visited once before. It was tucked away in the hills, where the air smelled of damp earth and jasmine, where the silence wasn't empty but full of the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of a bell, the slow rhythm of breath. An old monk greeted me with a gentle nod. "What brings you back?" he asked. I hesitated. I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I think I've been living my life for everyone else." The monk smiled knowingly, as if he had heard this before. He gestured for me to follow him, and we walked through the monastery garden, where a small bird was hopping between the branches of a plum tree. "Look at that bird," he said. "Is it worried about what the other birds think?" I shook my head. "No, it sings because it was born to sing," he continued. "It flies because it was born to fly. It does not look around, wondering if it is singing the right song or flying the right way. And yet, we humans, we forget how to simply be." I let those words settle into my heart. Then he told me a story. There was once a man who lived in a village at the base of a great mountain. Every day, he carried 2 large buckets of water up the steep path to the top, believing that only by reaching the peak would he be worthy of rest. The climb was exhausting, but he never questioned it. He had been told his whole life that he must prove himself. Years passed, and his back grew weary, but still he climbed. Then, one day, an old woman stopped him on the path. She pointed to the side of the trail, where a clear, flowing stream ran down the mountain. "Why do you carry those heavy buckets when there is water all around you?" she asked. The man froze. He had never noticed the stream before. He had been so focused on the climb, on proving his worth, that he had missed the water that had always been within reach. At that moment, he set his buckets down, and for the first time in his life, he felt free. The monk looked at me after telling the story. "Do you see?" I nodded slowly. "I've been carrying buckets I didn't need." He smiled. "We all do, until we realize we don't have to." I sat with that for a long time. It wasn't easy to let go of the need for validation. It had been a part of me for so long that I didn't know who I was without it. But I started small. I asked myself, would I still do this if no one was watching? I caught myself when I was about to seek approval and paused instead, choosing to acknowledge my own worth without waiting for likes or compliments. And most importantly, I reminded myself, what others think of me is their story, not mine. The more I let go, the lighter I felt. The more I stepped into my own truth, the more I realized I had been enough all along. And so are you. I used to believe that if I could just keep everything the same, if I could hold on tightly enough, I wouldn't have to face uncertainty. I thought stability meant safety, that if I resisted change hard enough, life would somehow stay in place, like an old photograph frozen in time. But life doesn't work that way. One autumn afternoon, I sat beneath a large maple tree, watching its golden leaves drift gently to the ground. They didn't cling to the branches, didn't resist the wind. They let go effortlessly, gracefully, and I wondered, why can't I do that? At the time, I was stuck in a job that drained me, stuck in a version of myself that no longer fit, stuck in a fear of the unknown that kept me from moving forward. I told myself I was being responsible, that change was risky, that I wasn't ready. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was just scared. It reminded me of a story I once heard at a Buddhist retreat. There was a young monk who had a robe, old, tattered, barely holding together. The fabric was thin, full of patches and frayed edges, but he refused to replace it. "I've had this robe for years," he told his teacher. "It's comfortable. It's familiar. I don't want to lose it." His teacher smiled. "Are you afraid of a new robe? Or afraid of who you'll be without this one?" That question echoed in my mind for weeks. Because isn't that what we do? We resist change not because we think the new path will be worse, but because we don't know who we'll be without the old one. We hold on to relationships that no longer nurture us. We stay in jobs that make us miserable. We cling to habits, identities, and versions of ourselves that no longer align with who we are becoming. Not because they serve us, but because they are familiar. The mind clings to what it knows, even when what it knows is no longer good for us. I finally let go of that job a few months later. It wasn't easy. At first, I felt like I had lost part of my identity. Who was I, if not the person I had spent years becoming? But slowly, something unexpected happened. I started to feel lighter, like a tree releasing its leaves in autumn. I realized I didn't have to hold on so tightly. I could trust that just as the tree grows new leaves in spring, I too would grow into something new. Buddha once said, "Nothing is permanent. Everything changes." At first, that idea frightened me, but now I find it comforting. It means that no matter how hard things feel, they won't stay that way forever. It means that just as the painful moments pass, so do the joyful ones, which makes them all the more precious. If you've been resisting change, ask yourself, what if this change is not happening to me, but for me? What if life isn't trying to take something away, but to make room for something better? We can fight against the seasons, or we can learn from them. Like the autumn leaves, we can learn to let go, not with fear, but with trust. Because when we stop fearing change, we stop fearing life itself. I used to believe that life was something I needed to catch up to. Like if I just planned better, worked harder, and worried enough, I could finally arrive at this perfect moment where everything made sense, where I would feel completely at peace. But somehow, peace always felt just out of reach. I remember one evening, sitting on a balcony, watching the sky shift from gold to deep purple. It was one of those sunsets so beautiful it almost didn't seem real. But instead of taking it in, I was on my phone, scrolling through emails, half listening to the wind, barely noticing the colors fading into darkness. And then it was gone. I had missed it, not because I wasn't there, but because I wasn't there. It reminded me of a Zen proverb I once read. A man is running through the forest when suddenly, a tiger appears behind him. He sprints, heart pounding, until he reaches the edge of a cliff. Below, another tiger pacing, waiting, trapped between danger and despair. He clings to a vine, dangling between life and death. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he sees something, a single ripe strawberry growing beside him. And in that moment, instead of focusing on the tiger above or the tiger below, he reaches out and takes a bite. That's it. That's the story. At first, I didn't understand. How could he enjoy something so small while his life hung by a thread? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this is how life actually is. We're always running, always worrying about what's chasing us or what lies ahead. And in doing so, we miss the strawberries, the small, fleeting joys that exist only in the present moment. The warmth of the sun on your skin, the sound of a child laughing in the distance, the way tea tastes on a quiet morning. Moments so simple, so ordinary, yet they are the very essence of life. Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." But how often do we actually do that? We replay old regrets, like rewinding a tape that can't be changed. We worry about things that haven't even happened yet, as if our anxiety could shape the future. And in doing so, we miss the only thing that's real, the now. So how do we stop ignoring the present moment? I've learned a few things. First, pause. Take a deep breath. Feel your feet on the ground. Notice the air around you. The simplest way to return to the present is through the body, because while the mind time travels, the body is always here. Second, let go of mental time travel. The past is a memory. The future is imagination. The only thing you ever truly have is this moment. And third, find small joys. Look for them. The way light filters through the leaves, the rhythm of your breath, the feeling of warm water on your hands. Life isn't waiting for us somewhere in the future. It's happening now. The only question is, are we paying attention? And so we return to where we began. The same world, the same life, but perhaps with softer eyes. Today, we talked about the habits that weigh us down, the things we unknowingly carry, and the freedom that comes from releasing them. But here's the truth. Letting go is not a one-time event. It's a practice. Like a tree that sheds its leaves in autumn, we too must release what no longer serves us. Again and again. The past, the fears, the expectations, none of these define us unless we let them. So as you move through your day, ask yourself, what am I holding on to that I no longer need? And when you find the answer, let it go. Gently, without force, like a leaf drifting into the river. If this message spoke to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your reflections in the comments. What habit resonated with you the most? And if you feel called to continue this journey of mindfulness and wisdom, join us by subscribing. The path to peace is not outside of you. It is already here, waiting, in the quiet space between your thoughts. Until next time, walk gently, breathe deeply, and remember, you are already enough. Thank you for being here. Namaste, dear friends. Take a deep breath and settle into this moment. Have you ever found yourself pouring endlessly into others? Your time, your kindness, your energy, only to feel unseen, unappreciated, and quietly exhausted? You give, hoping for connection, yet deep down you wonder, where is the peace? We've been taught that kindness opens doors, that being liked means belonging. But what if this belief is keeping us trapped? What if true peace isn't found in giving more, but in giving wisely? Buddhism teaches that compassion is not self-sacrifice, but balance. That to truly love others, we must first honor ourselves. So today, let's explore a different path. One where kindness has boundaries, where no is an act of wisdom, and where self-respect is the key to genuine connection. If this resonates with you, stay with me. Let's walk this path together. There was a time when I thought kindness was a currency. One that, if spent generously enough, would buy me love, belonging, and acceptance. Smile at everyone. Say yes to every request. Be endlessly available. And in return, I believed people would value me. I would be seen, appreciated, cared for. But life has a way of teaching us the lessons we refuse to learn willingly. I remember a particular evening, not too long ago, when exhaustion wrapped itself around me like a heavy, invisible cloak. I had spent the entire day helping, a friend who needed a ride, a colleague who needed just a quick favor, a relative who called to vent for an hour about the same problem they never intended to fix. My phone battery was nearly dead, but I felt even more drained than the device in my hand. I sat in my car outside my apartment, too tired to even step inside. And for the first time in a long time, a quiet, undeniable thought surfaced in my mind. No one ever asks if I need anything. The realization hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. Like suddenly noticing you've been carrying a heavy bag for miles without once stopping to check if you really needed everything inside it. I had mistaken being liked for being valued. And in doing so, I had poured myself into everyone around me without once considering if I was being refilled. Buddhism speaks often of suffering, how it is not merely pain, but the result of attachment. And one of the most insidious attachments we carry is our need for approval. From the moment we are children, we learn that being agreeable brings rewards. A smiling child is praised, a helpful friend is welcomed, an employee who never complains is favored. So we mold ourselves into the shape others expect, hoping that in doing so, we will be loved. But here's the truth we rarely pause to consider. Love given out of exhaustion is not love at all. It is sacrifice. There's an old Buddhist story that perfectly illustrates this. Imagine a great river flowing freely across the land. It nourishes trees, animals, and people along its way, bringing life wherever it touches. But one day, the river reaches a vast desert. It does not pause to consider. It simply continues to give, pouring its waters into the barren land. Yet no matter how much it offers, the desert remains dry. The sun drinks up every drop before it can soak into the soil. The river, once full of life, begins to wither. And then finally it stops, empty, depleted. Like this river, we pour our energy into places that cannot hold it. We say yes to people who take without giving. We bend ourselves to accommodate others, hoping they will one day do the same for us. But some people are deserts. They will take everything you give, not out of malice, but because that is their nature. And so, the real question is not, why don't they appreciate me? But rather, why do I keep giving to those who cannot receive? I used to believe that being needed was the same as being loved. That if I just did more, gave more, people would naturally return the kindness. But I was wrong. Love, respect, appreciation. These things do not grow in the barren soil of one-sided relationships. They grow where there is balance, where kindness flows in both directions. But how do we know when to stop? It begins with a pause, a single breath before answering, a moment of reflection before saying yes. When someone asks for your time, your energy, your effort, ask yourself, am I giving because I truly want to? Or am I giving because I'm afraid? Afraid of disappointing them, afraid of being seen as selfish, afraid that if I stop giving, they will stop valuing me. Because if your kindness is fueled by fear, then it is not kindness at all, it is self-abandonment. I wish I could tell you that the moment I realized this, I changed overnight, that I started setting boundaries effortlessly, that I never felt guilty for saying no, that I never again poured my energy into the wrong people. But that would be a lie. Growth is rarely instant. There were times I still overextended myself, times I agreed to things out of habit. But there were also moments of quiet victory. Times I took a deep breath and said, I can't right now, and felt the world continue spinning. Times I let a phone call go to voicemail without feeling the need to justify why I couldn't answer. Times I chose myself, not because I was angry or resentful, but because I finally understood. My energy is sacred. My kindness is a gift, not a debt. And do you know what happened? The right people remained. The ones who truly valued me never needed me to sacrifice myself for them. They respected my time, honored my boundaries, and understood that real love does not require exhaustion. And the ones who disappeared, they were the deserts, the ones who only valued me when I was useful to them. Let them go. Let them fade like footprints in the sand. Because at the end of the day, you are not here to be drained. You are not here to be endlessly available at the cost of your own well-being. You are not a river meant to run dry. You are here to live, to breathe, to give freely, but only in places where your kindness can take root and flourish. So the next time you feel that familiar tug, the one that says, say yes, be agreeable, don't disappoint them, pause. Ask yourself, is this a fertile field? Or is this a desert? And then choose wisely. There was a time when I believed that kindness meant always saying yes. That to be a good person, I had to be endlessly available, always there when someone needed me, always willing to help. It didn't matter if I was tired, overwhelmed, or had my own responsibilities. If someone asked, I gave. If someone needed, I provided. If someone expected, I delivered. And yet, the more I gave, the less I felt seen. The more available I was, the more invisible I became. It wasn't that people were unkind or ungrateful. No, it was more subtle than that. It was as if my willingness to always be there made me expected. Like a tree that provides shade in the summer, comforting, useful, but rarely noticed until the day it is gone. I remember one particular evening, the kind of evening that settles over you like a heavy blanket, thick, quiet, full of unspoken exhaustion. I had just finished another long day of doing things for others, running errands for a friend, covering a shift for a coworker, answering messages I didn't have the energy for. And as I sat alone, sipping a now cold cup of tea, a thought surfaced so clearly it felt like someone else had whispered it to me. When was the last time someone did something for me? I searched my memory, but instead of finding an answer, I found an even deeper realization. When was the last time I allowed someone to? That was the moment I understood something fundamental. It wasn't that people took me for granted. It was that I had never taught them to do otherwise. Buddhism speaks of equanimity not as indifference but as balance. A river does not flow endlessly in one direction without eventually running dry. A tree does not bend for every passing wind without breaking. And yet, how often do we ignore this truth in our own lives? How often do we believe that to be good, to be loved, we must give without limit? I once heard a story from a Buddhist monk that changed the way I thought about kindness. He spoke of a great tree standing in the heart of a dense forest. It had been there for hundreds of years, its roots deep, its branches wide. Travelers rested in its shade, birds nested in its limbs, and the forest around it flourished because of the shelter it provided. But this tree did not bend for every request. When the wind blew, it swayed, but it did not uproot itself for the sake of others. When travelers came, it offered shade, but it did not break itself apart to build their shelters. The tree remained standing, not because it refused to give, but because it understood that true giving is sustainable giving. That to continue offering, it must also preserve itself. This is the art of boundaries. We often mistake boundaries for walls, as if saying no is an act of rejection rather than an act of self-respect. But Buddhism teaches us that wisdom is knowing when to give and when to hold back. That generosity does not mean self-sacrifice. That we can be kind without being depleted. I had to learn this the hard way. At first, saying no felt foreign on my tongue, like an unfamiliar language I was just beginning to understand. I felt guilty. I felt selfish. I worried that people would be disappointed in me. But then something unexpected happened. The right people stayed, and the wrong ones faded. It wasn't immediate, but over time, I noticed a shift. The ones who had only valued me for what I could do for them slowly disappeared. But those who truly cared, they respected my space. They understood my limits. And some even began offering the same care to me in return. I wish someone had told me sooner that not everyone deserves unlimited access to you. That your time is precious, your energy is finite, and your kindness is a gift, not an obligation. I wish someone had told me that setting boundaries doesn't push away the right people. It reveals them. I remember the first time I told a friend, "I can't help with that today." My heart raced as I waited for disappointment, for frustration. But instead, they simply said, "That's okay." And just like that, I realized that my fear had been unfounded. That the people who truly matter don't demand more than you can give. They cherish what you do offer. Buddhism teaches that balance is the key to peace. If we do not respect our own limits, how can we expect others to? If we do not honor our own needs, how can we truly give without resentment? I had spent so long fearing that setting boundaries would make me lose people. But in the end, the only thing I lost was my own exhaustion. So now, when someone asks for my time, my energy, my presence, I pause. I ask myself, not out of selfishness, but out of wisdom. Is this a gift I can give freely, or am I giving out of fear? If I can give with love, I do. But if I feel drained, if I feel unseen, if I feel like the river flowing into the desert, I remind myself of the tree in the forest. Strong, steady, offering but never uprooting itself for the sake of another. And I say no, with kindness, with grace, without guilt, because I have learned that true generosity does not empty you. It nourishes you, too. I used to apologize for everything. I'd say sorry when someone bumped into me. I'd say sorry if I spoke too loudly, if I asked a question, if I took up space in a crowded room. I even caught myself apologizing to inanimate objects. "Oh, sorry," I'd mumble after accidentally brushing against a table or stepping on a creaky floorboard. At first, it seemed harmless, just a little verbal tick. But over time, I started to notice something unsettling. The more I apologized, the smaller I felt. My words, my presence, even my own needs. Everything felt like something to be excused, something to apologize for. One afternoon, I met an old friend for tea. As I slid into my seat, I blurted out my usual, "Sorry I'm late," even though I was only 2 minutes past the hour. My friend smiled and said something that caught me off guard. "You know," she said, stirring her tea, "you say sorry a lot. Have you ever noticed?" I laughed, brushing it off.
"Oh,
She tilted her head, studying me for a moment. "Why? I opened my mouth to respond but found that I had no answer. Why did I say sorry so much? I carried that question with me for days, turning it over like a pebble in my hand. And then, slowly, the truth began to surface. I apologized because, deep down, I believed I was an inconvenience. I apologized because I was afraid of taking up too much space, of being too much, of making others uncomfortable. I apologized because, somewhere along the way, I had learned that my presence needed to be softened, that my voice needed to be smaller, that my needs should never impose on anyone else. But here's the thing, existence is not something to apologize for. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from attachment. Attachment to ideas, to expectations, to the need for approval. And for many of us, one of the deepest attachments we carry is the belief that we must earn our place in the world. That we must be easy, agreeable, uncontroversial. That we must never disrupt, never burden, never be anything other than perfectly accommodating. But the Buddha also taught that true peace comes from understanding our own worth. There's a famous story in Buddhist teachings about a monk who was insulted in the marketplace. A man, filled with anger, hurled words meant to wound, to provoke. But the monk simply stood there, serene, unmoved. When asked why he did not defend himself, why he did not react, the monk smiled gently and said, "If someone offers you a gift, but you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" This story stayed with me for a long time. Just as we do not have to accept insults, we do not have to apologize for simply being. I started paying attention to my words, catching myself before the automatic "sorry" could slip out. First, it felt strange, like breaking an old habit. But over time, I replaced those apologies with something different, something that did not shrink me. Instead of "sorry I'm late," I said, "Thank you for waiting." Instead of "sorry to bother you," I said, "Do you have a moment?" Instead of "sorry, can I ask something?" I simply asked, and something changed. I started feeling more present in my own life. My words felt stronger, my presence more solid. I no longer carried the weight of constant self-erasure. But the most surprising thing, no one minded. The world did not crumble when I stopped apologizing for every little thing. No one thought I was rude or inconsiderate. In fact, the people who truly cared, the ones who valued me, began responding differently. They listened more closely. They took my words more seriously. Because when we stop apologizing for existing, we teach others to respect our presence, too. One day, not long after I had started changing this habit, I was walking down a busy street when someone bumped into me. Hard. My old instinct kicked in, and the word almost escaped my lips. "Sorry." But then I stopped myself. I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't caused harm. I hadn't been in the wrong place. So instead, I simply stepped aside and kept walking. And just like that, I realized I had given up something that had never belonged to me in the first place. The burden of unnecessary guilt. It takes time to unlearn the habit of over-apologizing. But here's what I've found. Every time you choose not to apologize unnecessarily, you reclaim a piece of yourself. Every time you speak with confidence instead of self-doubt, you stand a little taller. Every time you acknowledge your own worth, the world takes notice. And in doing so, you begin to live not as an apology, but as a presence. There was a time when I couldn't say no. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid. Afraid of disappointing people. Afraid of seeming selfish. Afraid that if I stopped saying yes, if I stopped being available, people would stop valuing me. It's strange, isn't it? How we convince ourselves that our worth is tied to how much we do for others. That the more we give, the more we are loved. But love, real love, does not demand that we exhaust ourselves. I learned this the hard way. One evening, after a particularly long day, my phone buzzed with a message from a friend. She needed a favor. Nothing big, just a little something. I looked at the screen, at the words glowing softly in the dim light of my living room. I could feel the familiar response rising in me. Of course, I can help. But then, something inside me hesitated. I was tired, really tired. The kind of tired that settles deep into your bones, making even the smallest request feel like climbing a mountain. And yet, even in that exhaustion, I felt the pull to say yes. Because what if she got upset? What if she thought I didn't care? What if she stopped asking altogether? I stared at my phone, fingers hovering over the keyboard, when I suddenly remembered a story I once heard about a wise monk who lived in the mountains. Many people came to him for guidance, and he welcomed them with kindness. But one day, after listening to a visitor's concerns for hours, the monk gently shook his head and said, "I cannot help you anymore today." The visitor was taken aback. "But I need you. I've come all this way." The monk smiled. "By saying no, I give you the gift of space. You will find your own answers." When I first heard this story, I didn't quite understand it. A gift? How could saying no be a gift? But as I sat there, phone still in hand, something clicked. Saying no was not rejection. It was respect. Respect for my own time. Respect for my own energy. And most importantly, respect for the fact that I, too, deserved care. So, for the first time in a long time, I took a deep breath and typed out a different response. "I'd love to help, but I can't today. I hope you understand." I pressed send before I could second-guess myself. And do you know what happened? Nothing. The world did not end. My friend did not get angry. She simply replied, "Of course, take care of yourself." I sat there, staring at the message, realizing how much unnecessary weight I had been carrying. How many times had I assumed that saying no would make people love me less, when in reality, the people who truly cared never expected me to give more than I could. Buddhism teaches that attachment is the root of suffering. And one of the attachments we struggle with most is our need for approval. We say yes because we want to be good, kind, helpful. We say yes because we fear that if we don't, we will lose something: friendship, respect, belonging. But true connection does not come from self-sacrifice. It comes from balance, from knowing when to give and when to hold back, from understanding that our time, our energy, our well-being, they matter too. I used to think that setting boundaries would push people away. But what I've learned is this: the right people will respect them, and the wrong people, they will leave. And that's okay. Now, when someone asks for something, I pause. I check in with myself. Do I have the energy to do this? Am I saying yes because I want to, or because I feel like I should? If I can give freely without resentment, I say yes. But if my body, my mind, my heart tells me otherwise, I give myself permission to say no. Not with guilt, not with fear, but with love. For myself, and for those who will understand. I understand exactly what you're looking for. Part 5 should seamlessly weave together compassion and wisdom, showing how they complement the lessons on boundaries, mindful giving, and self-respect. It should feel like a natural conclusion, offering a Buddhist perspective on kindness that is both heart-centered and wise. The storytelling should remain warm, reflective, and deeply engaging, like a quiet conversation over tea, full of insight yet soothing in its delivery. Here's part 5, expanded in that spirit. There was a time when I believed that being a good person meant always putting others first. That kindness meant giving without question, sacrificing without hesitation, and saying yes even when my heart whispered no. I carried this belief for years, wearing it like a badge of honor. I thought it made me selfless. I thought it made me strong. But one day something changed. I was speaking to a Buddhist teacher, sharing my exhaustion, my quiet resentment, my endless need to give. I expected him to nod in approval, to reassure me that I was on the right path. Instead, he smiled gently and asked me a question that has never left me. If a mother bird gives all her food to her chicks but does not eat herself, what happens? I hesitated. She grows weak. He nodded. And then, she can no longer care for them, I admitted. His eyes softened. Compassion without wisdom is like that mother bird. It gives until there is nothing left. But true compassion, real, balanced compassion, knows that to care for others, we must also care for ourselves. That was the first time I truly understood the union of compassion and wisdom. Buddhism teaches that compassion, karu, and wisdom, prajna, must go hand in hand. Like two wings of a bird, they must work together. One without the other will only lead to imbalance. Too much compassion without wisdom? We deplete ourselves, give beyond our capacity, and suffer in silence. Too much wisdom without compassion. We become cold, distant, calculating. Our boundaries turn into walls, our self-respect into isolation. But when these two qualities flow together, we learn the art of mindful kindness. A kindness that is not exhausting, not draining, but sustainable. A kindness that nurtures both the giver and the receiver. I used to think that setting boundaries made me less kind. But now I understand boundaries are an act of love. When we say no, not out of selfishness, but out of wisdom, we give others the space to grow. We stop enabling toxic dynamics. We stop overextending ourselves to people who only take. When we stop apologizing for existing, we teach others to value our presence. When we learn to give mindfully, rather than endlessly, our kindness becomes something real, something powerful, something that actually makes a difference. A river that nourishes wisely does not waste itself in the desert. A tree that stands firm provides shade without falling. A monk who knows when to say no gives the greatest gift of all, self-respect. And so, the next time you feel guilty for saying no, remember this: compassion is not self-sacrifice. Compassion is wise, and wisdom is kind. The moment you find this balance, you will begin to give, not from obligation, not from fear, but from a place of true love. For yourself, and for others. I want you to imagine something. Picture a candle burning in the quiet of a darkened room. Its flame flickers gently, steady yet fragile, giving off warmth and light to everything around it. Now imagine someone comes along and asks for some of its flame to light their own candle. The candle offers its fire without hesitation, and a second light appears. Another person comes, then another, each lighting their own wick from the original flame. At first, this seems like a beautiful act of generosity. The candle is giving freely, spreading light. But what happens when too many take from it? What happens when it burns itself down to nothing? It disappears. It gives until there is nothing left. And then the room is dark once more. This is the nature of compassion without wisdom. We give until we have nothing left for ourselves. Until we are exhausted, depleted, barely holding on. We mistake kindness for self-erasure, mistaking self-sacrifice for love. But here is what Buddhism teaches us. True compassion does not burn itself out. True compassion is sustainable, balanced, and wise. This is why wisdom and compassion must walk hand in hand. One without the other leads to suffering, either for ourselves or for those we are trying to help. There's a story from the Buddha's life that illustrates this so well. One day, a young monk came to the Buddha, weary and exhausted. He had spent months caring for others in the monastery, fetching water, cooking meals, tending to the sick. He worked tirelessly, always the first to rise and the last to sleep. Yet despite his efforts, he felt something wasn't right. He was irritable, fatigued, even resentful at times. And so he asked the Buddha, "Master, why do I feel so empty when I have given so much?" The Buddha smiled gently and said, "If a man crosses a river with a small boat and picks up too many passengers, what happens?" The monk frowned. "The boat sinks." The Buddha nodded. "So too with compassion. If you carry too much without balance, you will sink beneath the weight of it. Compassion must be guided by wisdom, just as a boat must know its limits." This was the lesson I had never been taught, the lesson I wish I had learned sooner. For years, I believed that love meant selflessness, that the more I gave, the more worthy I became, that being a good person meant never turning anyone away, never prioritizing my own needs, never saying no. But I had misunderstood. Selflessness, when misunderstood, becomes self-neglect. And self-neglect is not noble. It is not kind. It does not make us more virtuous, more loving, or more enlightened. In truth, it only makes us weaker. Because how can we truly show up for others if we are running on empty? How can we give genuine kindness when we are exhausted, drained, and resentful? Buddhism teaches that true compassion begins within. Think of a lotus flower floating on the surface of a still pond. Its petals open to the morning sun, its roots anchored deep in the mud below. The lotus is beautiful because it is nourished. It has what it needs to thrive. Now imagine if that same lotus were constantly uprooting itself, trying to give all its nutrients to the other plants around it. Imagine it stretching itself thin, giving so much that its own petals begin to wilt. That is what happens when we give without boundaries. A tree does not give all its water away to the surrounding plants. It takes what it needs to stay strong, so that it can continue to provide shade and shelter. A river does not flow endlessly into the desert. It directs its waters where they will nourish life. The Buddha himself never taught limitless giving. Instead, he taught skillful giving, knowing when to help, how much to offer, and when to step back. Because sometimes, stepping back is the most compassionate thing we can do. I once had a friend who was always in trouble. She would call late at night with problems, always needing help, always needing someone to listen. And I was always there, picking up the phone, offering advice, rearranging my plans to support her. But no matter how much I gave, nothing changed. I felt obligated. I felt like I was doing the right thing. But deep down, I also felt something else. Exhaustion, frustration, a quiet anger I didn't want to acknowledge. And then one day I didn't pick up the phone. Not because I didn't care, not because I wanted to abandon her, but because I realized something important. My help was no longer helping. She didn't need another late-night conversation. She needed to face things on her own, and I needed rest. When I finally spoke to her again, something surprising happened. She had solved the problem on her own. By not always being available, by stepping back, I had given her something far more valuable than my time. I had given her the space to grow. This is wisdom. This is compassion with boundaries. It took me a long time to understand that love is not measured by how much we sacrifice. True love, whether for a friend, a family member, or even ourselves, is measured by how skillfully we give. A mother does not feed her child by starving herself. A teacher does not enlighten students by staying silent. A candle does not give light by burning itself to nothing. You do not have to deplete yourself to be kind. You do not have to say yes to be worthy of love. You do not have to be everything for everyone to be enough. So the next time you feel guilty for saying no, for taking a step back, for choosing yourself, remember this: you are not a bottomless well. You are not here to pour endlessly until you are empty. You are here to shine, to love, and to live with both compassion and wisdom. And in that balance, you will find peace. I want you to imagine a quiet temple, nestled in the heart of a lush forest. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint scent of incense and damp earth. In the courtyard, a young monk sits with his teacher, both watching the gentle ripples on a lotus pond. The old monk, wise and serene, finally speaks. "Tell me," he asks the younger one, "if someone comes to you with a heavy burden, should you carry it for them?" The young monk, eager to prove his understanding of kindness, nods without hesitation. "Of course, master. If I can ease their suffering, I must." The old monk smiles, dipping a hand into the water. He lifts a single droplet and lets it fall back into the pond. "And if another person comes, I will carry their burden too," the young monk replies. "And another, and another." The young monk hesitates now. The old monk simply looks at him. "At what point, my dear student, does your kindness become your suffering?" The young monk lowers his gaze, thinking deeply. This is the paradox of compassion. We want to help. We want to be kind. But if we take on too much, we become the ones who suffer. In Buddhism, there is a teaching called the middle way, the path between extremes. It is neither indulgence nor complete self-denial. It is balance. It is wisdom. It is knowing when to give and when to step back. There is a misconception that kindness means sacrificing ourselves completely, that to be compassionate means we must say yes to everyone, to be available at all times, to always carry the burdens of others. But Buddhism teaches us otherwise. True compassion is not about taking all the weight from someone's shoulders. It is about helping them learn how to carry it themselves. A good teacher does not simply give answers. He guides his student to find them. A good parent does not shield their child from all hardships. They teach them how to navigate life. A good friend does not solve every problem for another. They stand beside them as they figure it out. There was a time when I thought love meant doing everything for someone. I would overextend myself, thinking that if I just did a little more, gave a little more, things would be better. I believed that if I wasn't always available, I would be letting people down. But here's what I've learned. When we give too much, we take away someone else's chance to grow. When we say yes out of guilt, we invite resentment into our hearts. When we never allow ourselves to rest, we become too exhausted to truly show up for those we care about. Buddhism teaches us that intention matters. Giving with love is beautiful, but if we give out of obligation, out of fear, out of guilt, that giving is not pure. It drains us, creates suffering, not only for ourselves but for those around us. Have you ever noticed that when you are tired, even the smallest request feels overwhelming? That is because you cannot pour from an empty cup. This is why boundaries are not just necessary. They are an act of wisdom and love. Imagine if the sun never set, if it burned across the sky endlessly, never resting, never dimming. Would we call that kindness? Would we say, "Ah yes, the sun is so compassionate, it never takes a break"? No, we would call it unnatural, unsustainable, and in the end, even the sun would burn itself out. Everything in nature follows a rhythm, a time to give and a time to rest. The tides move in and out. The trees shed their leaves in autumn and bloom again in spring. Even the Buddha himself took time for solitude, withdrawing into meditation before returning to teach. So why do we, as humans, believe we must always be available? There is wisdom in pausing, in knowing that you do not have to answer every call, respond to every request, or solve every problem. In understanding that your time, your energy, your presence, they are sacred. When you say no, you are not rejecting someone. You are honoring yourself. When you set a boundary, you are not withholding love. You are ensuring that the love you give is pure, intentional, and sustainable. There is great compassion in telling someone, "I cannot carry this for you, but I believe in your strength to carry it yourself." There is deep wisdom in knowing that when you protect your own peace, you are able to show up fully, joyfully, and with true generosity when it truly matters. So ask yourself, are you giving because you want to, or because you feel like you have to? Are you helping in a way that truly serves others? Or are you carrying burdens that do not belong to you? And most importantly, when was the last time you gave yourself the same kindness that you so freely offer to everyone else? Because in the end, the greatest lesson of all is this: compassion begins with you. Imagine standing by a great river, watching the water flow. Some streams nourish fertile land, bringing life and growth. Others spill into barren deserts, disappearing into the heat. Where is your energy flowing? Into places that appreciate and reciprocate, or into those that leave you empty? Buddhism reminds us, we are not here to be endlessly available. We are here to be present, intentional, and wise. True kindness does not mean saying yes to everything. It means knowing when to step back, when to protect our peace, and when to let go. So I leave you with this. What will you choose today? Will you continue giving until you are empty? Or will you begin to honor your time, your boundaries, and your worth? If this teaching spoke to you, share your thoughts below. Your journey matters. And if you wish to walk this path of wisdom together, join our community. Subscribe, reflect, and let's continue discovering the beauty of a balanced life. Until next time, may you be at peace. You ever notice how some people just have a presence? They don't need to wear anything flashy or expensive. There's just something about them. It's not the clothes. It's the way they carry themselves. I remember this one morning in Kyoto, sitting in a little cafe, sipping tea, watching people come and go. And then this older woman walked in. She wasn't fancy. She wasn't trying to stand out. She wore a simple indigo kimono, the fabric soft with age, every fold carefully arranged. She sat down at a table by the window, completely at ease. No fidgeting, no adjusting her clothes, just steady, like she belonged there, like she belonged anywhere. I leaned over and said, Your kimono is beautiful. She smiled, running a hand over the fabric. I've worn this for years. It feels like an old friend. Then she looked outside and said something that stuck with me ever since. The world moves fast, but my heart stays steady, like the mountain. My clothing is just an extension of that steadiness. That hit me, because most of us, we don't dress like that. We grab whatever's clean, whatever works, and rush out the door. But what if getting dressed was about more than just putting on clothes? Your clothes tell a story. What's yours saying? Think about it. You know that feeling when you put on your favorite outfit? Not the trendy one, not the expensive one, the one that just feels right. Maybe it's that old sweatshirt that somehow still smells like home. Or those broken-in jeans that fit like they were made for you. Or that leather jacket that makes you feel like you can take on the world. It's not about fashion. It's about how it makes you feel. And when you wear something that feels like you move differently. You stand taller. You feel more comfortable in your own skin. That's what dressing with intention is all about. It's not about impressing anyone. It's about showing up for yourself. You ever notice how some people walk into a room and immediately command attention? Not because of what they're wearing, but because of how they carry themselves. There's something about them, a quiet confidence, a presence that doesn't need loud colors or designer labels. I remember one morning at a little cafe in Kyoto. It was the kind of place where time slows down, where the smell of freshly brewed tea lingers in the air, and where the sound of wooden floors creaking under careful footsteps feels like part of the conversation. She walked in, an elderly woman, moving with the kind of grace that only comes from years of knowing exactly who you are. Her indigo kimono was old but pristine. Every fold was neatly arranged, every stitch carefully mended. She didn't dress to impress anyone. Yet, she was unforgettable. Curious, I leaned in and told her, "Your kimono is beautiful." She smiled, smoothing the fabric over her lap. "I've worn this for many years," she said. "It feels like an old friend." She paused, looking out the window. The world changes so fast, but my heart stays steady, like the mountain. My clothing is an extension of that steadiness. And that stuck with me, because isn't that what we all want? To feel at home in our own skin, no matter how much the world shifts around us. What you wear is more than just clothes. Most people don't think twice about what they put on in the morning. They grab whatever's clean, whatever looks halfway decent, and they're out the door. But what if getting dressed wasn't just about covering our bodies? What if it was about grounding ourselves, about feeling right in our own space? There's a reason we all have that one outfit that makes us feel good. Not because of the brand or the trend, but because of how it makes us feel inside. Like that old soft sweater you throw on after a long day. The leather jacket that's been with you through every adventure. The jeans that fit just right. It's not about fashion, it's about connection. Simplicity is power. In Buddhism, simplicity isn't about giving things up. It's about keeping what truly matters. There's a Zen story about a young monk who asked his master, "How can I be more elegant?" The master handed him a simple, worn robe. "Wear this," he said. The monk frowned. "But this is plain." The master just smiled. "It is clean. It is whole. It was given with love. If you wear it with mindfulness, you will be elegant." That's the thing about real elegance. It doesn't scream for attention. It just is. Some of the most put-together people I've met didn't wear the fanciest clothes, but they always looked effortlessly themselves. They weren't chasing trends. They weren't trying too hard. They just knew who they were, and their clothing reflected that. Dressing with intention is self-respect. Ever notice how your mood shifts based on what you're wearing? There's a reason for that. When you're in something stiff and uncomfortable, you feel stiff and uncomfortable. But when you're in something that fits just right, something that feels like you, it changes everything. You carry yourself differently.
You stand taller.
You breathe a little easier. Dressing with intention isn't about impressing other people. It's about showing up for yourself. It's about picking clothes that feel good against your skin. Choosing colors that make you feel alive. Wearing things that remind you of who you are and where you're going. It's an act of self-respect. like making your bed in the morning or taking the time to prepare a good meal. Make it a meditation. What if getting dressed became more than just a routine? What if, instead of rushing, you took a moment to choose? Tomorrow morning, try this. Pause. Don't just grab the first thing you see. Feel. Pick something that makes you feel like you. Not what you should wear. What you want to wear. Own it. Stand in front of the mirror. Roll your shoulders back. Breathe. When you wear something with intention, it's not just an outfit. It's an extension of you. And that's something people notice. Your clothes tell a story. Make it one you love. That old woman in the cafe? She wasn't dressed to impress. But she left an impression anyway. Not because of the fabric, but because of the energy she carried. She wore her kimono like a second skin. Like it belonged to her. That's what dressing with intention does. It makes you feel at home in your own body. And when you feel at home in yourself, you carry that energy into the world. So tomorrow, when you stand in front of your closet, ask yourself, does this feel like me? Because when your clothing aligns with your spirit, you don't just look good, you radiate something deeper. And that's the kind of beauty that never fades. Why learning never gets old. I was in a little bookstore the first time I really got the idea that learning never stops. You know the kind. Shelves stacked high with books, the smell of old pages hanging in the air, that soft jazz humming from a speaker in the corner. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but I picked up a book about something I knew absolutely nothing about, woodworking of all things. I wasn't planning on building a table anytime soon, but as I flipped through the pages, something inside me lit up. It wasn't just about the information. It was about the feeling, that little spark in your brain when you realize there's still so much out there you haven't explored yet. That's when it hit me. Learning doesn't have an expiration date. But you know what's funny? A lot of people act like it does. I'm too old for that. The biggest lie we tell ourselves. At some point, we start thinking learning is for kids. That once we've got a career, a family, a routine, that's it. We're set. We tell ourselves things like, I'd love to learn the piano, but I should have started when I was younger. I always wanted to try painting, but what's the point now? A new language? At my age, my brain doesn't work like that anymore. And just like that, we close the door. But let me tell you about a Zen master who didn't believe in too old. The 90-year-old calligrapher. There's a famous story about a Zen master who, at 90 years old, decided to learn calligraphy. His students were shocked. Master, they asked, why start now? He just chuckled and said, because when I turn 100, I want to be great at it. That line gets me every time, because it flips everything we think about learning on its head. Most people assume they missed their chance. But the truth? If you're still breathing, you're still learning. And if you're still learning, you're still growing. What happens when we stop learning? There's a Buddhist proverb that says, the mind is like a garden. If you don't tend to it, weeds will grow. Think about that. If you leave a garden alone for too long, it doesn't stay the same. It starts to wither. The weeds creep in, choking out what was once thriving. The same thing happens to us. When we stop learning, when we stop exploring new ideas, our world shrinks. We start saying the same things, thinking the same thoughts, reacting the same way. Life becomes predictable, stale, small. But when we keep learning, the world stays big. Our minds stay sharp. We wake up with a sense of curiosity, with that feeling of, I wonder what I'll discover today. And that's what keeps us alive. Learning isn't just about books, though books are pretty great. Here's the thing. Learning doesn't mean sitting in a classroom or memorizing facts. It's in the conversations you have with strangers. It's in trying something totally out of your comfort zone. It's in the way you challenge your own beliefs and let yourself see things differently. I know a retired doctor who picked up pottery at 72. I spent my whole life fixing people's bodies, he told me. Now I just want to make something beautiful with my hands. A friend of mine, 65 years old, decided to learn Spanish just so she could connect with her neighbors. I butcher it most days, she laughed. But every time I get a word right, I feel like I'm 20 again. That's the magic of learning. It doesn't just keep your mind young, keeps your spirit young. Why being a beginner is terrifying? and why that's a good thing. I get it. Starting something new is scary. Nobody likes being bad at something. Nobody likes feeling awkward or slow or unsure. But let's be real. Every expert was once a beginner. Every musician once played a wrong note. Every artist once drew a terrible picture. Every writer once wrote something that made no sense. The only difference between the ones who get good and the ones who don't, the ones who get good let themselves be bad at first. They don't let the fear of looking foolish stop them. They don't quit just because they're not instantly great. And over time, they get better. That's how growth works. That's how we learn. So where do you start? If you've read this far, there's probably something you've always wanted to learn. Maybe it's painting, or dancing, or writing. Maybe it's a language, or a sport, or a musical instrument. But you've told yourself it's too late. So here's my challenge to you. Start anyway. Pick up a book. Watch a tutorial. Take that first messy, awkward step. Don't worry about being good. Don't worry about what people think. Just be curious. Because at the end of the day, the happiest, most fulfilled people aren't the ones who had it all figured out. They're the ones who never stopped exploring. And if you're alive, if you're still here, then your story isn't done yet. So tell me, what's something you've always wanted to learn? And what's stopping you from starting today? Slow down, moving through life with purpose. Ever notice how some people walk into a room, and before they even say a word, you feel them? It's not about how they look or what they're wearing. It's something deeper. The way they move. The way they carry themselves. I saw it once on an ordinary afternoon in a quiet park. I was rushing, half walking, half texting, my mind already on the next thing. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed him. An older man, maybe in his 70s, walking so slowly, so deliberately, that it almost looked like time had slowed down just for him. He wasn't distracted. He wasn't hurrying. Every step was placed with intention, as if he was fully aware of the ground beneath his feet. The way the wind moved through the trees, the warmth of the late afternoon sun on his face. And in that moment, I realized something. Most of us don't walk, we rush. Your posture says more than you think. The way you move says a lot about what's going on inside. When you're stressed, your shoulders hunch. When you're anxious, your movements are quick, almost restless. When you're uncertain, you fidget, shrink into yourself, make yourself smaller. But when you stand tall, when you walk with confidence, with ease, that's when you move with purpose. There's a saying, your energy enters the room before you do. And you know it's true. You've seen it, the kind of person who walks in, and instantly you can feel their presence. It's not about being loud. It's not about demanding attention. It's about being there. And that's something you can't fake. Why do we always feel the need to hurry? It's funny, isn't it? We rush through our days like we're late for something important. But what exactly are we rushing toward? We rush through meals and barely taste them. We rush through conversations without really listening. We rush through life, always focused on what's next, and then wonder why everything feels like a blur. But what if we just slowed down? The monk who never rushed. There's an old story about a monk who was known for moving slowly, deliberately, no matter what was happening around him. One day, a frustrated student asked, "Master, why do you never hurry?" The monk smiled and said, "Because where I need to be is exactly where I am." That line has stuck with me for years. Because how often do we actually feel that way? How often do we let ourselves just be instead of constantly trying to be somewhere else? How you move changes how you feel. I'll tell you something interesting. If you're feeling anxious, if your mind is racing, if everything feels overwhelming, change how you move. Stand up a little taller. Roll your shoulders back. Take a deep breath. Walk a little slower. It's a small shift, but it changes everything. Because the way you carry yourself isn't just about how others see you. It's about how you feel inside. Walking like you mean it. The Buddha taught mindful movement. Not just sitting still in meditation, but bringing that same awareness into everyday motion. Try this sometime. 1. Pause for a second before you walk. Feel your feet on the ground. 2. Breathe. Take 1 deep breath before you move. 3. Walk like you mean it. Not rushed, not distracted, just present. It sounds simple, right? But when's the last time you actually walked without your mind being somewhere else? Confidence isn't about moving fast. It's about moving with intention. Have you ever watched someone who's really comfortable in their own skin? They don't rush. They don't fidget. They don't look around for approval. They move with ease. Because real confidence isn't about trying to prove something. It's about trusting yourself. The next time you walk into a room, pay attention to how you move. Are you rushing, shrinking, holding tension in your body? Or are you walking like you belong there? Life moves fast, you don't have to. I still think about that old man in the park. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't trying to get somewhere faster. And yet, he had a presence that made me stop in my tracks. And I wonder, how many moments do we miss because we're too busy rushing to the next thing? How different would life feel if we slowed down, even just a little? Because at the end of the day, we're all walking somewhere. The question is, are you actually here for the journey? The beauty in growing older. Why aging isn't fading, it's deepening. I was about 10 years old the first time I really noticed gray hair. I was sitting at the kitchen table watching my grandmother peel an apple. Her hands, steady and sure, worked the knife in one long, unbroken ribbon. The afternoon light hit her hair just right, turning the silver strands almost white. "Grandma, why is your hair changing color?" I asked. She chuckled, not looking up from the apple. "Because I've lived, sweetheart. Every strand has a story." At the time, I just nodded, not really understanding. But now I get it. Why are we so afraid of aging? Somewhere along the way, society convinced us that aging is something to fight. That wrinkles should be smoothed out, gray hair should be covered, and the goal is to stay looking young for as long as possible. But think about it, why? Why do we treat aging like a problem? Like something to be ashamed of? Because if you really stop and look, you'll see that the most beautiful people aren't the youngest. They're the ones who have truly lived. The stories written in our skin. Take a second. Think about the lines on your face. The little creases by your eyes. Those came from years of laughter. The faint furrow on your brow. From moments of deep thought. Maybe worry, but mostly wisdom. The soft folds around your mouth. Proof of every word spoken with kindness. Every kiss placed on a child's forehead. Every moment you smiled, even when life wasn't easy. So why do we try to erase them? I once met an elderly woman at a cafe, and she had that kind of effortless presence. Graceful, unbothered, completely at home in herself. Her silver hair shimmered in the sunlight as she sipped her coffee. I couldn't help but ask, "Have you ever thought about dyeing it?" She smiled, running a hand through her hair. To hide it would be to erase the journey that made me who I am. That hit me, because isn't that what we do when we try to cover up the signs of aging? We pretend the years haven't shaped us, that we haven't grown, that we haven't lived. But we have lived, and that's something to be proud of. Aging isn't fading, it's deepening. Somewhere along the way, we started equating beauty with youth. But real beauty isn't just about smooth skin or thick hair. It's about presence. It's about wisdom. It's about knowing who you are and owning it. I've met women in their 70s and 80s who are more radiant than people half their age. Not because of how they look, but because of how they live. There's an old Japanese philosophy called wabi-sabi, the art of embracing imperfection. In this tradition, when pottery breaks, they don't throw it away. They fill the cracks with gold, making it even more beautiful than before. What if we saw ourselves that way? Not as something to be fixed or restored to some earlier version, but as something even more beautiful because of the life we've lived. The silver crown of wisdom. In Buddhist teachings, gray hair isn't something to be hidden. It's something to be honored. A silver crown of wisdom, proof of all the lessons learned, the struggles overcome, the love given and received. The Buddha himself had a turning point in his life when he saw an old man for the first time. He realized that aging wasn't a curse. It was an awakening. A reminder that life is short and that what matters most isn't how we look, but how we live. And yet, here we are, obsessing over anti-aging products, as if staying young is the only way to be valued. But you know what? Youth is just the first chapter. The best parts of the story come later. What are we really afraid of? Most of us don't fear aging itself. We fear what it represents. We fear becoming invisible. We fear losing our strength. We fear not being seen the way we used to be. But let's flip that for a second. What if aging isn't about losing anything at all? What if it's about gaining something deeper? Every year you live is another chapter added to your story. Every wrinkle is a lesson learned. Every silver strand is proof that you have been here, that you have experienced life in all its messiness and beauty. That's not something to fear. That's something to celebrate. Living with grace, not resistance. So how do we start embracing aging instead of fighting it? 1. Wear your years like a badge of honor. Every laugh line, every silver strand. It's all part of your story. Own it. 2. Take care of yourself, but not because you're chasing youth. Eat well, move your body, but do it to feel strong. Not because you think looking younger will make you more worthy. 3. Shift your mindset. Instead of focusing on what's changing, focus on what's deepening. Your wisdom, your sense of self, your ability to love without fear. 4. Find role models who inspire you. Surround yourself with people who show that life doesn't stop being beautiful as you age. It just gets richer. What if we saw aging as a privilege? Because let's be real, what's the alternative? Not everyone gets the chance to grow older. Not everyone gets to see their hair turn silver, their hands soften from years of holding loved ones, their faces lined from decades of laughter. Aging is not a curse, it's a privilege. So the next time you look in the mirror and notice a new wrinkle, a new gray hair, don't sigh, don't wish it away, smile, because that's proof that you are alive, that you have lived. And what could be more beautiful than that? One last thought. I still think about my grandmother at that kitchen table, the way the light hit her silver hair, the steady rhythm of her hands as she peeled that apple. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant when she said, "Every strand has a story," but now I do, and I hope you do too. So tell me, if your silver strands and laugh lines could talk, what stories would they tell? Nourish your body with love and respect, treating yourself like a sacred vessel. The first time I realized my body wasn't just mine, but something I had been entrusted with, I was sitting in the quiet of my grandfather's garden. The air smelled of damp earth and citrus. It was late afternoon, and he was tending to his lemon trees the way he always did, slowly, methodically, as if the act itself was a meditation. I watched as he carefully pruned the branches, checking the soil, adjusting the way the water flowed to nourish the roots. "Why do you take such good care of them?" I asked. "They grow anyway." He smiled without looking up. "Because what you take care of takes care of you." At the time, I thought he was just talking about his trees. But now, years later, I understand he was talking about so much more. Because the truth is, our bodies are like those trees, living, breathing vessels that carry us through life. And yet, we often treat them as afterthoughts, something to push through rather than something to honor. Your body is not a burden, it's a home. Somewhere along the way, we learn to see our bodies as projects. Things to be fixed, sculpted, measured, criticized. Too big, too small, too slow, too soft. We talk about them as if they're separate from who we are. But what if, instead of viewing our bodies as things to battle with, we saw them as sacred spaces? The one place we are guaranteed to live for our entire lives. Think about it, your body has been with you through everything. Every heartbreak, every joy, every long night, and every early morning. It has carried you even when you weren't kind to it. It has fought for you even when you ignored its needs. Isn't it time we started treating it with the respect it deserves? A monk's lesson on the body. There's an old Buddhist story about a monk who was known for being meticulous about his diet and exercise. Unlike others, he didn't eat mindlessly or neglect physical movement, but instead treated every meal and every step with intention. One day, a younger monk asked him, "Why do you care so much about this body? I thought we were supposed to detach from the physical world." The older monk smiled and said, "This body is my only vehicle for reaching enlightenment. If I neglect it, how will I complete my journey?" That perspective changed something in me, because our bodies are not distractions from our spiritual lives. They are part of it. Caring for your body is not about vanity, it's about self-respect. Eating with awareness. What are you feeding your body? Have you ever eaten something so quickly that you barely tasted it? Shoveled down a meal while scrolling on your phone, barely aware of what you were putting in your mouth? We all do it. But food is more than fuel. It's the foundation of how we feel, how we move, how we think. Imagine if, instead of rushing through meals, we treated eating like a ritual. Drink water like it's cleansing your soul. Take a deep breath before you sip, and picture it restoring you from the inside out. Eat foods that nourish rather than deplete. Not because you're chasing a number on a scale, but because your body deserves to feel good. Savor each bite. Taste the sweetness of fruit, the richness of whole foods, the warmth of a home-cooked meal. Let eating be something that grounds you, not just something you check off a list. Movement. A love letter to your body. Somewhere along the way, exercise became something we punish ourselves with. We use words like burn, shred, push harder. We think of it as a chore, a way to shrink ourselves, a way to earn the right to enjoy food. But what if movement wasn't about punishment? What if it was about joy? Think about how a child runs, not because they have to, but because they want to. The way they spin in circles just to feel dizzy. The way they jump into puddles just because it feels fun. What if we moved like that? Take a walk, not because you should, but because fresh air makes you feel alive. Stretch in the morning, not because you have to, but because it feels good to open up space in your body. Dance in the kitchen while you make dinner, because why not? Your body was meant to move, not to be punished, but to be celebrated. Rest, the most overlooked form of self-respect. In a world that glorifies hustle, rest feels like rebellion. We wear exhaustion like a badge of honor. We brag about how little sleep we get, how busy we are, how much we're pushing through. But let's get real, burnout isn't something to be proud of. Your body is not a machine. It's not meant to run on empty. And the idea that you have to earn rest? That's a lie. Give yourself permission to sleep when you're tired. Not just enough to function, but enough to thrive. Take breaks without guilt. Your worth is not measured by productivity. Listen to what your body is asking for. Some days that might be movement. Some days that might be stillness. Both are okay. Rest is not laziness. It's necessary maintenance for the only home you'll ever live in. What happens when you start treating your body like a sacred vessel? Something shifts. You start to move differently, not just physically, but emotionally. You stop fighting against yourself. You stop seeing your body as an enemy, and instead you see it as a partner. You start thanking it instead of criticizing it. Thank you, legs, for carrying me through my hardest days. Thank you, hands, for holding the people I love. Thank you, heart, for beating even when I forget to slow down. When you nourish your body with love and respect, you start to realize that taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's a way of saying, I belong here. I deserve to feel good. I am worthy of this life. One last thought. I still think about my grandfather in that garden. The way he tended to his lemon trees, never rushing, never neglecting them, always giving them what they needed to grow strong. And I realize now he was teaching me how to take care of myself. Because the way you treat your body, that's the way you treat life itself. So, tell me, when was the last time you truly listened to what your body was asking for? And more importantly, when will you start? Kindness, the ultimate elegance. The first time I saw kindness change a moment, it was in the most ordinary of places, a grocery store checkout line. I was standing there, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, watching the woman in front of me fumble through her purse. She looked flustered, embarrassed, her hands shaking slightly as she searched for her wallet. The cashier waited, expressionless, while the line behind her grew impatient. People sighed. Someone muttered under their breath. And then, out of nowhere, the man behind her, just a regular guy in a worn-out hoodie, stepped forward and said, "Hey, take your time. We're all good here." That's it. Just a few words. But you could see it in her face. The way her shoulders loosened. The way she let out a breath she'd probably been holding for too long. The moment shifted. The tension in the air dissolved. She found her wallet, paid, and turned to him with a quiet, heartfelt thank you. And I realized, kindness doesn't have to be grand. It just has to be given. Why we underestimate kindness. Somewhere along the way, we started thinking of kindness as extra. A nice thing to have, but not necessary. We live in a world that often values ambition over empathy, speed over sincerity. We're taught that success is about being strong, independent, efficient. But here's the thing, kindness is strength. Take strength to be patient when you're in a hurry. Take strength to be gentle when the world is harsh. It takes strength to choose compassion when it would be easier to look away. The woman who cleaned the benches. In a small monastery, there was an elderly woman who spent her days wiping down wooden benches. She never sat on them herself. One day, a visitor asked, "Why do you clean these benches every day if you never use them?" She smiled and said, "The one who will sit here next may be weary. If I can make their moment more pleasant, then my day is complete." That story stayed with me, because real kindness isn't about recognition. It's not about proving anything. It's about doing something simply because it makes someone else's life a little lighter. And in a world where people are always chasing things, success, status, approval, there's something undeniably elegant about the kind of person who doesn't need to chase anything at all. Kindness leaves an imprint. Think about the people you remember the most. Not the ones with the biggest houses or the flashiest cars, but the ones who made you feel something. The teacher who believed in you when no one else did. The stranger who gave you directions when you were completely lost. The friend who sat with you in silence when words weren't enough. Kindness is like that, it lingers. Long after people forget what you said or what you did, they remember how you made them feel. And that's timeless. The subtle power of small acts. We often think kindness has to be big. Buying someone's coffee, donating to charity, volunteering for a cause. And yes, those things matter. But more often than not, it's the small moments that change people. Holding the door open a second longer. Smiling at the cashier who looks like they've had a rough day. Sending a message to someone just to say, "Hey, I was thinking about you." None of these things take much effort, but they can shift the course of someone's day in ways we don't always see. Because the truth is, we never really know what someone is carrying. That person who cut you off in traffic? Maybe they just got bad news. That coworker who snapped at you? Maybe they haven't felt heard in a long time. That stranger who seemed distant? Maybe they're just trying to hold it together. And kindness is the only thing that can cut through that weight. Why it's hard to be kind sometimes. Let's be real, kindness isn't always easy. Some days we're exhausted, we're stressed, we're frustrated. And let's be honest, not everyone makes it easy to be kind. Some people are rude, impatient, ungrateful. So why should we bother? Because kindness isn't about them. It's about you. Who do you want to be in this world? Do you want to add to the noise? Or do you want to be the quiet moment of peace someone didn't even realize they needed? We don't have to wait for people to deserve kindness. We give it because it's who we are. Kindness is contagious and it comes back to you. There's a story about a man who walked into a diner one rainy afternoon. He sat alone, looking tired, like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. A waitress, sensing something unspoken, brought him a warm meal on the house. "Just take care of yourself," she said. The man was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, thanked her, and left. Months later, a letter arrived at the diner. It was from that man. He wrote, "That night, I was at my lowest. I had lost my job. I didn't know if I could keep going. But your kindness reminded me that people still care. It gave me enough hope to hold on." You never know what your kindness might mean to someone. You might not see the ripple it creates, but it's there. Choosing kindness every day. The Dalai Lama once said, "My religion is very simple. My religion is kindness. Not because it's flashy, not because it's easy, but because it's everything." So what does kindness look like in daily life? Be patient when it would be easier to be frustrated. Be generous when you can, even if it's just with your words. Look people in the eye. Listen to them. Make them feel seen. Kindness isn't weakness. It's not passive. It's one of the most powerful choices you can make. A final thought, I still think about that moment in the grocery store. The way a simple sentence from a stranger turned stress into relief. I think about the woman in the monastery, cleaning benches for people she would never meet. And I think about you. The world is loud, it's fast, it's chaotic. But in the middle of all that, you have the power to be the quiet moment of grace that someone else needs. So tell me, who will you be kind to today? Stay active, stay vibrant, move like you mean it. The first time I really noticed movement, I was sitting on a park bench, sipping my coffee, half distracted by my phone. The morning air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up before the caffeine does. And then I saw him, an older man, maybe in his 70s, moving through the grass with the kind of slow, deliberate grace you don't see much anymore. His arms flowed like waves, his steps light but intentional. He wasn't rushing, wasn't trying to get anywhere. He was fully there. Something about the way he moved made me put my phone down. I just sat and watched. When he finished, I walked over and said, "That was incredible. What are you doing?" He smiled. "Tai Chi," he said, "keeps me feeling alive." I nodded, still mesmerized. "You move like you're savoring every second." His smile widened. "Because I am," he said. "When you rush, you miss life itself." And just like that, something clicked. Movement isn't just exercise, it's life. Most of us don't think about how we move. We just do it, rushing from one place to another, slouching in front of screens, pushing through workouts like we're checking off a list. But movement, real movement, is not about burning calories or staying in shape. It's about feeling alive in your body. Think about it, kids don't run just to exercise. They run because they want to. They jump, spin, dance, and roll around because it feels good. When was the last time you moved like that? Not to work out, not to stay fit, but just because it felt good to move. Your body and mind are connected. There's a reason you feel better after stretching in the morning. A reason a walk can clear your mind. A reason dancing around the kitchen to your favorite song makes everything feel lighter. The Buddha taught that a body in motion keeps the mind clear, the spirit joyful, and the energy radiant. We tend to separate physical health from mental health, but they're not separate at all. When we move, we shift our energy. We let go of tension. We open ourselves up, literally and emotionally. Ever notice how the days you sit around doing nothing are the days you feel stuck in your head? But the days you move, go for a walk, stretch, even just stand up and breathe, something shifts. That's not an accident. That's nature. Find a way to move that feels like you. Not all movement looks the same. For some people, it's yoga, slow, intentional, like a conversation with your body. For others, it's hiking, feet pressing into the earth, lungs filling with fresh air. Maybe for you, it's dancing in the living room, rolling your shoulders to the rhythm of an old song. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that it feels good. Because the more you enjoy movement, the more you'll want to do it. Not because you have to, but because it makes you feel alive. The beauty of moving slowly. We live in a world that glorifies speed. Fast cars, fast results, fast everything. But the man I met in the park, he wasn't in a hurry. When I was younger, he told me, I rushed through life. Work, family, responsibilities. I moved fast because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. He shook his head, smiling. Then I got older, and I realized rushing doesn't get you anywhere faster. It just makes you miss the view. That stuck with me. Since then, I've tried moving slower, walking without checking my phone, stretching with intention, taking a deep breath before stepping forward. And you know what? Feels different. Feels like living. Movement is the secret to aging well. Ever wonder why some people seem to glow as they get older? Why they still have energy, still have that spark? It's not just luck. It's movement. When we stop moving, we don't just lose flexibility, we lose vitality. Our world gets smaller. We stop engaging, stop feeling connected, stop flowing. But when we keep moving, no matter how small, it keeps us alive. I met a woman in her 80s who still did yoga every morning. When I asked her why, she laughed and said, "Because my body is my home, and I want to keep it livable." That changed the way I see things. Because your body, is not a problem to fix. It's a home to care for, a simple way to start moving more. Tomorrow morning, before reaching for your phone, before checking emails, before getting lost in the rush of the day, try this. 1. Stand up. Feel your feet on the ground. 2. Take a deep breath, the kind that fills you up completely. 3. Stretch slowly. Reach your arms up. Roll your shoulders. Move your neck gently from side to side. 4. Step forward with intention, not to get somewhere, just to feel what it's like to move. That's it. Less than a minute. But it changes the way you start your day. Because movement isn't just about staying active. It's about staying present. What are you waiting for? I still think about that man in the park. The way he moved with ease. The way he seemed to savor each step. And I think about how often we ignore our bodies. Treat them like machines, push them past exhaustion, take them for granted. But the body is always there for us, waiting for us to come back to it. So here's my question for you. When was the last time you truly felt your body move? Not out of obligation, not out of habit, but just because it felt good. Because when you start moving with intention, with gratitude, with joy, you don't just stay active. You stay alive. The people you keep shape the life you live. It's funny how some people make you feel lighter just by being around them, while others seem to drain every last drop of energy out of you. You ever spend time with someone and walk away feeling exhausted? Like you just ran an emotional marathon, but you never even left your chair? Or maybe you've had the opposite happen. You meet up with a friend, and afterward you feel better, clearer, more yourself. That's not a coincidence. The people in our lives, our friends, family, coworkers, whether we realize it or not, they shape us. The way we think, the way we see the world, even the way we feel about ourselves. And the truth is, not everyone is meant to go where you're going. The weight we carry. I had a friend once, someone I'd known for years, since childhood. We had history, memories, inside jokes that only made sense to us. But as we got older, I started noticing something. Every conversation felt heavy. It was always about what was wrong, what wasn't fair, who had done what to whom. Negativity, complaints, drama. It was like carrying a backpack full of rocks. But I didn't realize it at the time. I kept telling myself, we've been friends forever. That has to mean something. But then I asked myself a different question. If I met this person today, would I still choose them as a friend? And that question hit me harder than I expected. Because sometimes we hold on to people out of habit, not because they're actually good for us. The lightness of true friendship. There's an old Buddhist story about a monk who wanted to teach his students about friendship. He led them to a still pond and dropped 2 stones into the water, one light, one heavy. The light stone floated, moving gently with the ripples. The heavy stone sank straight to the bottom. The monk turned to his students and said, "True friends are like the light stone. They support you, move with you, and never pull you under. But the wrong people, they will drag you down before you even realize it." It's a simple story, but it makes you think. Who in your life feels like the light stone? And who feels like the heavy one? Letting go without guilt. Here's the hardest part. Letting go of people who aren't meant for you anymore. It doesn't mean you hate them. It doesn't mean you wish them harm. It just means your paths are different now, and that's okay. Not every friendship is meant to last forever. Some people are chapters in your book, but not the whole story. And when you start choosing yourself, choosing peace, choosing growth, some people won't understand. They'll make you feel guilty for changing. But here's what I've learned. People who truly love you won't be threatened by your growth. They'll grow with you, and the ones who don't, they were never really in your corner to begin with. Who you surround yourself with is who you become. The Buddha once said, if you want to know your future, look at your friends, because the people closest to you influence your mindset, your habits, your energy, your sense of possibility. Ever notice how spending time with someone ambitious makes you feel motivated? Or how being around constant negativity makes you start seeing the worst in everything? That's why choosing your circle is one of the most important decisions you'll ever make. Finding the right people. The good news? When you start letting go of the wrong people, you make room for the right ones. People who celebrate your wins without jealousy. People who challenge you to grow, not hold you back. People who make you feel like the best version of yourself. The kind of people who, when you walk away from them, you don't feel drained. You feel lighter. A final thought. I still think about that question sometimes. If I met this person today, would I choose them as a friend? Because the truth is, we get to choose. We get to decide who we let into our energy, who we invest in, who we walk through life with. So ask yourself, who in your life lifts you up? And who is quietly pulling you under? And more importantly, are you ready to let go of the weight? Laugh often, love freely. The secret to a light heart. It was one of those afternoons where everything felt heavier than it should. You know the kind, when your to-do list feels never-ending, when life just keeps coming at you without a pause. I was sitting in a small cafe, half-heartedly stirring my coffee, when I heard it. Laughter. Not the polite kind, not the forced kind, but deep, belly-shaking, can't hold it in joy. I turned my head and saw him. An older man, maybe in his 70s, leaning back in his chair, his whole body shaking with laughter. His face crinkled in delight, his hands clapping together as if he had just heard the funniest joke in the world. Something about it was contagious. Even though I had no idea what he was laughing about, I smiled. The barista smirked. A couple at the next table chuckled, and soon the whole cafe felt lighter, as if the weight of the day had lifted just a little. And that's the thing about laughter. It spreads. It softens. It reminds us that not everything has to be taken so seriously. Why do we stop laughing? Think about kids. They laugh all the time, at silly faces, made-up jokes, the sheer joy of running for no reason at all. They find humor in everything because they aren't afraid to look ridiculous. But as we grow older, we get serious. We trade playfulness for productivity. We tell ourselves we're too busy to slow down and enjoy the little things. We start filtering our joy, holding back our laughter, worrying about how we look instead of how we feel. And before we know it, the lightness fades. But here's the truth. Life doesn't get easier when we take it more seriously. It just gets heavier. Laughter is the shortcut to letting go. I once read that laughter is like an exhale for the soul. When we laugh, really laugh, we release tension. We let go even just for a moment. Have you ever been in a stressful situation and suddenly something absurd happens? And even though you should be serious, you can't help but laugh? That's because laughter breaks the cycle. It reminds us that no matter how messy life gets, there's still room for joy. It's not about ignoring the hard stuff. It's about not letting it steal your light. The man who laughed like a temple bell. There's a story about a man named Haru. He lived in a quiet village, surrounded by rolling hills, and was known for one thing: his laughter. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, you could hear it ringing through the mist, echoing like a temple bell. People would ask, "Haru, how are you always so happy? What's your secret?" And he'd smile and say, "I laugh not because life is perfect, but because I've learned to embrace its imperfections." That was his gift. He didn't wait for life to be just right to find joy. He found it anyway. And that's the trick, isn't it? Not waiting, not holding off on happiness until everything aligns. Because happiness isn't something you find, it's something you choose. Joy lives in the small moments. We often think happiness is this big thing, something we'll reach once we finally get the job, the house, the relationship, the perfect version of ourselves. But what if it's not? What if joy is in the small things, the ones we overlook every day? A warm cup of tea on a cold morning, the way sunlight filters through the trees at just the right angle, a song on the radio you forgot you loved, the smell of fresh bread from a bakery down the street, a conversation that makes you lose track of time. Happiness isn't a destination. It's in the moments between the big things. And the more we learn to notice those moments, the lighter life feels. Love without holding back. Laughter and love go hand in hand. Because real love, the kind that fills you up, not drains you, isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's choosing to love even when life is messy, even when things aren't guaranteed, even when there are no promises. Loving freely means saying, "I love you," when you feel it, instead of waiting for the perfect moment. Hugging someone a little tighter, a little longer, just because, laughing at the ridiculous, silly things together, forgiving even when it's hard, choosing to be open even after you've been hurt. We spend so much time guarding ourselves, protecting ourselves from pain. But in doing that, we also block out joy. What if, instead, we let love in without overthinking it, without analyzing every little thing, without waiting for guarantees? What if we just felt more? The beauty of an unscripted life. One day, when we look back, it won't be the serious things we remember most. It'll be the nights we laughed until we cried. The moments we let ourselves be ridiculous. The times we loved with our whole hearts, without holding back. That's what makes a life full. Not perfection, not control, just being here, fully, in the mess and the beauty of it all. A final thought, I still think about that man in the cafe. The way his laughter filled the space, how it softened something in everyone around him. And I wonder, what would happen if we all let ourselves laugh a little more? Not because life is easy, not because everything is perfect, but because it isn't. And maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point. So tell me, when was the last time you laughed? Really laughed? And what's stopping you from doing it more? Never stop evolving. The beauty of becoming. It was one of those late summer afternoons where time felt slower, where the air was thick with the scent of earth and sun-warmed leaves. I sat by a quiet pond, staring at a single lotus flower rising from the muddy water. I was feeling stuck that day, like I had been running in circles, trying to figure out who I was supposed to be, what I was meant to do, how I could finally feel like I had it all together. An older man sat on a bench nearby, watching the same flower. He must have noticed the way I was lost in my own thoughts because, after a long pause, he said, "The lotus doesn't fight where it grows. It doesn't resist the mud. It just reaches for the light." I turned to him, a little surprised, and he smiled. "That's how life works," he continued. "You're not meant to stay the same. You're meant to evolve." And just like that, something in me shifted. We are not meant to arrive, we are meant to grow. Somewhere along the way, we were taught that one day we'd arrive, that there's some final version of ourselves, the one who has it all figured out, who never doubts, never struggles, never questions anything anymore. But that day never comes, because life isn't about arriving, it's about becoming. Think about it, are you the same person you were 5 years ago? 10 years ago? Your thoughts have changed, your priorities have shifted, your heart has learned new things, some beautiful, some painful, but all important. And yet we resist change. We hold on to old versions of ourselves because they feel familiar, even when we've outgrown them. But here's the thing, growth isn't comfortable. And it's not supposed to be. The tree that keeps reaching. There's a story of a young disciple who was frustrated with his journey. He went to his master and asked, "When will I finally reach enlightenment?" The master didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to a giant tree standing on the edge of the monastery grounds. "That tree has stood here for over a century," he said. "Yet it still grows toward the sky. So must you. And that's the truth of life. Growth doesn't have a final destination. The happiest, most fulfilled people I know aren't the ones who have everything figured out. They're the ones who are still learning, still expanding, still reaching. Letting go of who you used to be. One of the hardest things in life is letting go of past versions of ourselves. We hold on to old identities, old beliefs, old habits, not because they still serve us, but because they feel safe. But you are not the same person you were last year. You are not the same person you were a decade ago. And you don't have to be. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to grow into something new. You are allowed to leave behind anything that no longer fits who you are becoming. The snake sheds its skin. The trees release their leaves in autumn. The river doesn't fight its path. It bends, it adapts, it keeps moving. So why do we hold on to things that no longer serve us? Growth happens in the uncomfortable places. We love the idea of transformation, but we don't always love the process. Because real growth, it happens in the messy moments. It happens when we step outside our comfort zones. It happens when we face things we've been avoiding. It happens when we're willing to be uncomfortable in order to become something more. Have you ever looked back on a hard time in your life and realized it shaped you in ways you didn't expect? That's growth. And it rarely happens when everything is easy. Why we fear change? Let's be honest, change is scary. Even when we want it, even when we know it's necessary, there's a part of us that resists. Because change means stepping into the unknown. It means leaving behind what is familiar. It means facing uncertainty. But you know what's scarier than change? Staying the same when your soul is ready for more. You are still becoming. There is no final version of you. Every day you are still becoming, still unfolding, still discovering, still growing into the person you are meant to be. The job you have now, it may not be the one you have in 5 years. The beliefs you hold now, they may evolve as you learn more, experience more, understand more. The dreams you have now, they may expand in ways you never imagined. And that's a good thing, because life isn't meant to be static. You are not meant to be static. You are here to evolve. A simple reminder for the journey. Whenever you feel stuck, whenever you doubt yourself, whenever you wonder if you're on the right path, remember this. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You don't have to be the same person you were yesterday. You are allowed to grow, to change, to shift. Because just like the lotus in the mud, just like the tree that never stops reaching, you are always moving toward the light. A final thought, I still think about that old man by the pond, the way he watched that lotus bloom as if it held the secrets of the universe. And maybe it does, because in that moment I understood, we are not here to arrive. We are here to bloom. So tell me, where is your growth leading you next? And are you willing to embrace the journey? That woman in the cafe, she wasn't trying to make a statement. She wasn't trying to get noticed, but she did. Not because of what she was wearing, not because of how much it cost, but because she knew who she was, and she wore it literally. That's the real secret. It's not about having the perfect wardrobe. It's about picking things that make you feel at home in your own skin. So tomorrow, when you're standing in front of your closet, don't just grab whatever's clean. Ask yourself, does this feel like me? Because when it does, you don't just look good, you feel good. And trust me, people notice. Now, I gotta ask, what's one piece of clothing you own that just feels right every time you wear it? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. You ever feel like life just flips the table on you when you least expect it? 1 minute you're cruising, everything steady, predictable, maybe even a little too comfortable, and then out of nowhere, bam. The job you thought was secure? Gone. The person you thought would always be there walks away. The future you were so sure about just disappears. And suddenly, you're left standing in the middle of the wreckage, trying to figure out what the hell just happened. I remember this one night. It's burned into my brain like a scene from a movie. I was sitting alone in my apartment, staring at a candle flickering on the table. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. My chest was tight, my stomach heavy, and my brain wouldn't shut up. I kept running through every what if imaginable, trying to make sense of something that had just unraveled in front of me. It's that feeling, you know? When something you thought was solid just isn't anymore. And you keep asking yourself, why? Why is this happening? Why now? But here's the thing, I wish I had known that night. Maybe the better question isn't why is this happening? Maybe it's what is this teaching me? Because the truth is, it's not change that wrecks us. It's the way we fight against it. You ever notice how life has this funny way of turning everything upside down just when you start to feel comfortable? 1 minute, you're coasting, job's good, relationships are stable, everything feels predictable, and then out of nowhere, boom, something shifts. A call in the middle of the night. A job you thought was secure suddenly gone. A person you love walking away. And just like that, the ground beneath you isn't so solid anymore. I remember this one night, sitting alone in my apartment, staring at a candle flickering on the table. It was quiet, too quiet. Hours earlier, something I thought I could never live without had been ripped away from me. My chest felt tight, my stomach heavy, my mind racing through every what if imaginable. It's that feeling, you know? When life doesn't go the way you planned, when the future you imagined is suddenly out of reach. If you've ever been there, you know how it feels like standing in the ocean, just as a massive wave is about to crash over you. There's no escape, and in that moment, one thought keeps circling in your head. Why? Buddhism has a way of answering that question. Not with some sugar-coated reassurance that everything happens for a reason, but with something much deeper, something that shifts the way you see life itself. At the core of it all is this one simple truth. Everything changes. Nothing stays the same. Your emotions, your relationships, your body, your thoughts. Everything is constantly moving, flowing, transforming. It's called anicca, impermanence. And the crazy thing? It's not change itself that hurts us. It's our resistance to it. Think about it. Have you ever tried holding on to something that was slipping away? A relationship that had run its course? A job that no longer fulfilled you? A version of yourself that you had outgrown? The harder you cling, the more painful it becomes. It's like holding on to a handful of sand. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips through your fingers. That's suffering. Not because life is cruel, but because we expect things to stay the same when they never do. Look at the trees in autumn. Do they cry when their leaves start falling? Do they panic, desperately trying to glue them back on? No, they just let them go. Because deep down, they trust that spring will bring new leaves. But imagine if a tree resisted, holding on to every dried up leaf, refusing to let go. It would suffocate itself under the weight of what was never meant to stay. And that's what we do to ourselves when we resist the natural flow of life. I used to think letting go meant losing, that if I accepted change, I was giving up. But that's not it at all. Letting go isn't about surrendering. It's about making space. It's about understanding that when something leaves your life, it's making room for something new. It's about trusting that, even when you can't see it yet, life is unfolding exactly the way it's supposed to. A while back, a friend of mine lost his job. He was devastated. This was the career he had built for years, the thing that gave him purpose. For weeks, he was stuck in this loop of, why me? And this isn't fair. But then, something shifted. Instead of fighting what had already happened, he started asking himself a different question. What if this isn't the end? What if this is just the beginning of something else? And you know what? A few months later, an opportunity he never could have imagined landed in his lap. Something that gave him more freedom, more fulfillment than he'd ever had before. Looking back, he told me, losing that job was the best thing that ever happened to me. I just didn't know it at the time. It's funny how life works like that. When you're in the middle of change, it feels like everything is falling apart. But often, it's just falling into place in ways you don't understand yet. I think about the caterpillar trapped inside its cocoon. If it had a mind like ours, it would probably be freaking out. What's happening to me? Everything I knew is gone. This is the end. But what it doesn't realize is that it's transforming. It has no idea that on the other side of all that struggle, it's going to grow wings. So what if, instead of fearing change, we started seeing it as a teacher? What if we stopped seeing endings as something to grieve and started seeing them as invitations? An open door to something we never could have imagined for ourselves. What if the things we're afraid of losing were never meant to stay forever? I'm not saying it's easy. Letting go of something that once meant everything to you is one of the hardest things in the world. But what's even harder is holding on to something that's already gone. I heard this story once about a potter. He was making this beautiful clay pot, shaping it carefully, pouring his heart into it. But just as he was about to finish, he dropped it. It shattered into 100 pieces. At first, he thought it was ruined. But instead of throwing it away, he did something different. He picked up the broken pieces and started putting them back together. Only this time, he filled the cracks with gold. And when he was finished, the pot was even more beautiful than before. Stronger, more unique, more alive with its story. That's what life does to us. We break, we lose things, we go through pain we never saw coming. But those cracks, that's where the light gets in. That's where we grow. So if you're in the middle of a change that feels unbearable, if you're standing in the wreckage of what used to be your life, I want you to ask yourself this. What if this isn't breaking you? What if this is remaking you? Because life is always moving, always changing. And the sooner we stop resisting, the sooner we can step into the next version of ourselves, the version that was waiting all along. And maybe, just maybe, one day you'll look back at this moment and realize it wasn't the end at all. It was just the beginning. You ever wake up one day and realize that nothing in your life looks the way you thought it would? Like you had this plan, this picture in your head of how things were supposed to go, and then life just decided otherwise. Maybe it was a job you thought would last forever but didn't. Maybe it was a relationship you swore would be your forever but wasn't. Maybe it was a version of yourself that you believed in, only to wake up one day and not recognize who you've become. And when that happens, when life shifts under your feet without warning, there's this overwhelming feeling of what now? I remember sitting on my balcony one night, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The rain had just stopped, leaving the air thick with that clean, earthy smell. I was holding a cup of tea, but it had gone cold in my hands because my mind was somewhere else. Everything I had built, everything I had relied on, had unraveled in a matter of weeks. A relationship I thought would last, over. A career I had poured my heart into, gone. The future I had planned, completely wiped out. And I sat there, staring out at a world that kept moving, wondering how mine had come to a full stop. It's a strange thing when life changes before you're ready. One minute, everything feels stable, and the next, it's like you're standing on shifting sand. No footing, no control, no idea what comes next. And the only thought that keeps circling in your head is why? Why is this happening to me? But here's something I wish I had understood back then. Nothing lasts. Not the happiness, not the pain, not even the version of myself that was sitting on that balcony, convinced my world had ended. I didn't know it at the time, but that night wasn't my breaking point. It was my turning point, because if Buddhism has taught me anything, it's that the only thing guaranteed in life is change. Everything moves, everything shifts, everything transforms. And the real suffering, it doesn't come from change itself, it comes from the way we fight against it. Think about it. We hold on to people afraid to lose them. We grip tightly to jobs, identities, dreams, desperate to keep them exactly as they are. But life is like water. It flows, it moves, it reshapes itself every second. And the more we try to hold on to it, the more it slips through our fingers. Imagine standing in the middle of a river, the current pushing against you. You can plant your feet, resist with everything you have, but eventually the water wins. Or you can let go. You can lift your feet and allow yourself to be carried, not knowing where the river will take you, but trusting that it knows the way. There's a Japanese concept called mono no aware, a deep appreciation for the fleeting nature of things. That's why cherry blossoms are celebrated, not because they last, but because they don't. Their beauty is in their impermanence. Now think of a tree in autumn. It doesn't cling to its leaves, begging them to stay. It lets them go, knowing that spring will bring new ones. But we, as humans, we struggle with that. We grip tightly to what's already leaving, afraid that if we let go, we'll be left with nothing. But the truth is, letting go isn't about losing. It's about making space for what's next. I once knew a man who built his entire life around his business. It was everything to him, his identity, his pride, his reason for waking up in the morning. And then suddenly he lost it all. For months he was consumed by anger, regret, grief. He kept replaying every decision, wondering what he could have done differently. But then one day, instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" he asked, "What is this teaching me?" And that shift changed everything. He realized that who he was wasn't tied to what he had built. That losing one thing made space for another. That, like the tree in autumn, he could let go and trust that something new would grow in its place. And it did. It's funny how life works like that. When you're in the middle of change, it feels like everything is falling apart. But often, it's just falling into place in ways you don't understand yet. A caterpillar doesn't know it's about to become a butterfly. To it, the cocoon must feel like the end. But we know better. We know that transformation is happening. So what if we started seeing our own losses that way? What if, instead of grieving every ending, we started welcoming them as invitations to something we can't yet see? It's not easy. Letting go of something that once meant everything to you is one of the hardest things in the world. But you know what's even harder? Holding on to something that's already gone. There's a Zen saying I love, let go or be dragged. Because life will keep moving whether we're ready or not. Change will come. The only question is, are we going to flow with it or fight against it? There's an old Japanese practice called kintsugi. It's the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. Instead of hiding the cracks, they highlight them, because they believe something that has been broken and put back together is even more beautiful than before. And maybe that's what change does to us. It breaks us open, forces us to rebuild. But if we do it with care, with trust, with an open heart, we don't just return to who we were. We become something more. So if you're standing in the middle of change, feeling like everything is falling apart, just remember, you are not breaking. You are becoming. And maybe, just maybe, one day you'll look back on this moment and realize it was never the end at all. It was just the beginning of a life you never could have imagined for yourself. You ever hold on to something so tightly, afraid that if you let go, you'd lose a part of yourself? A relationship, a dream, a version of life you thought would last forever. And then one day, despite everything you did to keep it, it slips away anyway. And you're left standing there, hands empty, wondering how to move forward. I remember the exact moment I realized I was clinging to something that was already gone. It was late at night, and I was sitting alone in my apartment, staring at my phone. The last text I had sent was still sitting there, unread. Hours had passed, then days, and I kept checking, waiting for a response that would never come. I told myself that if I just held on a little longer, if I just said the right thing, if I just didn't let go, maybe things would go back to how they were. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Some things aren't meant to stay, and yet I couldn't accept it. It's funny how we convince ourselves that holding on is strength, when sometimes the real strength is in letting go. Buddhism teaches that attachment is the root of suffering. We suffer not because things leave us, but because we refuse to let them go. We grip tightly to what once made us happy, believing that if we lose it, we lose happiness itself. But happiness was never in the thing, it was in us, in the way we experienced it. And if we let it, happiness can return in a different form. But letting go is terrifying, isn't it? Feels like free falling, like stepping off a ledge and hoping something catches you. Because if we release the things we've built our identity around, the relationship, the success, the version of life we thought we were supposed to have, then who are we without them? A monk once told his student, holding on to anger is like holding a hot coal. You're the one who gets burned. But it's not just anger. It's anything we refuse to release. Regret, expectations, even love. We grip it so hard, afraid that if we let it go, we'll be left with nothing. But what if the space it leaves behind isn't emptiness? What if it's room for something new? I think about trees in autumn. They don't fight to keep their leaves. They don't mourn when the branches are bare. They trust that when the time is right, new leaves will grow. But we try to glue the leaves back on. We resist the seasons of our own lives, forgetting that everything is temporary. I once heard a story about a man who had spent years sculpting a beautiful statue out of stone. He poured his heart into every detail, shaping it with precision, believing it was his masterpiece. Then one day a storm came. The winds howled, the rain pounded, and when the sky cleared, his statue had cracked down the middle. He was devastated. He sat there for days, staring at what was left of his work, unable to accept what had happened. Then, finally, something shifted. Instead of seeing it as ruined, he saw it as unfinished. He picked up his tools and started carving again. This time, he let the cracks become part of the design. And when he was done, the statue was more beautiful than before. That's what letting go does. It doesn't erase what was. It allows us to reshape what's left into something new. But how do we actually do it? How do we release the things we've built our lives around without losing ourselves in the process? First, detach with love. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you love without possession. It means you appreciate something for what it was, instead of holding it hostage for what you wanted it to be. If a person leaves, it doesn't mean your love was wasted. If a dream changes, it doesn't mean the journey was meaningless. It simply means it's time for a new chapter. Second, understand that loss is not the enemy. It's the doorway to something else. We see loss as an ending, but what if it's actually an invitation? Think about it. Every new phase of your life only began because something else ended. You wouldn't be who you are now if not for the things you once had to say goodbye to. And third, practice gratitude for what is, instead of fearing what will be lost. If we spend our whole lives bracing for change, terrified of what we might lose, we miss out on everything we still have. Right now, in this moment, there is something beautiful in your life. Person and experience a small joy. Breathe it in. Let yourself feel it fully, knowing that it won't last forever. And that's what makes it precious. I think about that night on my apartment floor, staring at my phone, waiting for something that wasn't coming. If I could go back to that version of myself, I'd sit down beside them and whisper, "You're holding on to something that is already gone, and that's okay. Let it go. Something else is coming." And you know what? Something did. Because life doesn't leave us empty-handed. It just asks us to open our hands so it can place something new in them. So tell me, what are you still holding on to? And what might be waiting for you if you let it go? You ever notice how life has this way of completely ignoring your plans? One minute, everything feels like it's falling into place, and then, out of nowhere, it shifts. The job you thought you'd have forever is suddenly gone. The person you imagined growing old with becomes a stranger. A dream you nurtured for years crumbles before your eyes. And you sit there, staring at the pieces, asking yourself the same question over and over again. Why is this happening to me? I remember the day I learned what it really meant to surrender to life. It wasn't in a monastery or during some profound meditation session. It was on a cold, rainy afternoon, sitting in my car outside a coffee shop, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had just received the kind of news that makes your stomach drop, the kind that forces you to face a future you never saw coming. Everything I had worked for, everything I had built was unraveling. And no matter how much I tried to hold it together, no matter how hard I fought, life had made its decision. I sat there in silence, watching raindrops race down the windshield, my mind cycling through all the things I could have done differently. If only I had tried harder. If only I had seen it coming. If only I could fix it. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Some things are out of our control. And the more we resist them, the more we suffer. Buddhism teaches that acceptance is the key to peace. But let's be honest. Accepting the things we don't want to be true is one of the hardest things we'll ever do. We don't want to let go of the illusion that we're in control. We don't want to believe that sometimes, no matter how much effort we put in, life has other plans. But the truth is, peace doesn't come from control. It comes from knowing that even when things don't go our way, they're still going the way they're meant to. There's an old Zen story about a farmer who lived in a small village. One day, his horse ran away. The neighbors came to comfort him, saying, "What bad luck!" But the farmer simply shrugged and said, "Who knows if it's good or bad?" A week later, the horse returned, bringing with it a group of wild horses. The neighbors rejoiced, saying, "What good luck!" But again, the farmer only said, "Who knows?" Soon after, the farmer's son tried to tame one of the wild horses and fell, breaking his leg. The neighbors were quick to say, "What a terrible misfortune!" But the farmer, unfazed, replied, "Who knows?" Then, just a few weeks later, soldiers came through the village, recruiting young men for war. But because of his broken leg, the farmer's son was spared. What seems bad today might turn out to be the best thing for us tomorrow. And what we call good in the moment might later reveal itself to be something else entirely. We just don't know. I think about that story a lot. especially when life doesn't go the way I want it to. There have been moments where I was convinced that something was a disaster, only to realize later that it was the very thing that set me free. And other times, things I thought were blessings ended up teaching me some of the hardest lessons of my life. So maybe the real question isn't why is this happening to me? Maybe the real question is, what is this trying to teach me? I once met a woman who had lost everything. Her home, her business, the life she had spent years building. For a long time, she was stuck in that cycle of resistance, trapped in the "this shouldn't have happened" mindset. And then one day she made a choice. She decided to stop asking why and start asking what now. Instead of fighting against reality, she worked with it. She let go of the life she thought she was supposed to have and opened herself up to the one that was waiting for her. And what she found on the other side of surrender was a peace she had never known before. That's the thing about acceptance. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you don't try. It just means you recognize that some battles aren't meant to be fought. It means you understand that not everything needs to be controlled. So how do we actually do it? How do we stop fighting against reality and start making peace with it? First, we stop fighting what already is. So much of our suffering comes from arguing with the present moment, from wishing things were different instead of working with what we have. Imagine trying to fight the wind. It doesn't matter how strong you are, you're never going to win. But the moment you stop resisting, that's when you can start moving forward. Second, we find meaning in difficulties. No one likes pain. No one likes struggle. But every challenge carries a lesson. Sometimes it's patience. Sometimes it's strength. Sometimes it's the realization that what we were clinging to wasn't meant for us in the first place. Whatever it is, there's always something to learn. And third, we trust that the universe knows what it's doing. Even when we don't. Even when everything feels like it's falling apart. Even when we have no idea how things are going to work out. There have been moments in my life where I thought everything was lost, only to realize months or years later that what I thought was an ending was actually a beginning. I come back to that night in my car sometimes, to the version of me that was gripping the steering wheel, desperately trying to hold onto something that was already gone. If I could sit next to them now, I wouldn't try to fix it. I wouldn't tell them not to feel what they were feeling. I would just put a hand on their shoulder and say, "You don't have to fight this. You don't have to know what's coming next. Just trust that whatever is falling apart is making space for something new. Because life will keep moving. Doors will close. Plans will change. People will come and go. And the only real question is, are you going to fight against it? Or are you going to trust that, even when you don't understand it yet, things are unfolding exactly as they should?" So tell me, what is life asking you to accept today? And what might be waiting for you on the other side of surrender? Have you ever felt like life was testing you? Like every time you tried to stand back up, something knocked you down again? There was a time when I asked myself that question almost every single day. It felt like life had decided to throw every challenge it could at me, and I couldn't understand why. I had lost someone I loved, watched a dream slip through my fingers, and found myself standing in the middle of a life I no longer recognized. And the worst part? No one could tell me when the storm would pass. I remember one particular night, late, past midnight. The world outside my window was quiet, but inside my mind, a war was raging. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling this deep, hollow ache in my chest. Why is this happening to me? The question looped over and over in my head. I wanted answers. I wanted something, anything, to make the pain make sense. But all I got was silence. And then, somewhere in that silence, a thought emerged, soft but insistent. What if this isn't just happening to me? What if this is happening for me? It wasn't a comforting thought at first. Felt ridiculous, even offensive. How could loss, heartbreak, failure, how could any of this possibly be happening for me? But that question, it wouldn't let go. And the more I sat with it, the more I started to see something I hadn't before. Maybe life wasn't punishing me. Maybe it was teaching me. Pain is a ruthless teacher, but it's also the most effective one. There's this story in Buddhism about a caterpillar. When the time comes for it to transform, it seals itself inside a cocoon. its body dissolving into something unrecognizable. And then comes the struggle, the fight to break free. It pushes and writhes, struggling against the shell that once protected it. And here's the thing, if someone were to help it, to break the cocoon open too soon, the butterfly wouldn't survive. It wouldn't have the strength to fly. That struggle? It's necessary. And isn't that how life works? The things that challenge us, the moments that break us open, those are the very things that shape us into who we are meant to be. But the catch is, we have to be willing to learn. Because pain doesn't automatically make us wise. If we resist it, if we drown in self-pity, we miss the lesson entirely. But if we lean in, if we ask, what is this trying to teach me? That's when pain becomes wisdom. I once knew a man who lost everything overnight. His business, his savings, the life he had spent years building. At first, he was consumed by anger. He spent months blaming the world, convinced that life had been unfair to him. But one day, he met a retired entrepreneur who had gone through something similar. The old man listened patiently, then said, "You have two choices. You can sit in the ashes of what you lost, or you can use them to build something new. The fire has already come, whether you like it or not. The question is, are you going to let it destroy you or refine you?" That conversation changed everything for him. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" he started asking, "What can I create from this?" And slowly he rebuilt. Not the same life, but a new one. One that was lighter, freer, and filled with things he never would have had if he hadn't first lost it all. I think about that a lot. How sometimes what feels like an ending is really an invitation. An invitation to let go of what no longer serves us. An invitation to become something more than we were before. So how do we do it? How do we take pain, the thing we spend our whole lives trying to avoid, and turn it into something that helps us grow? First, instead of resisting it, we observe it. Pain is uncomfortable, but it has something to say. What if, instead of trying to escape it, we got curious? What is this teaching me? What patterns is it revealing? The lessons are always there, waiting for us to see them. Second, we trust that everything, even the hard stuff, is for our growth. I know how impossible that sounds when you're in the middle of it. But think about all the things you've survived. How many of them, in hindsight, led you somewhere unexpected? How many of them made you stronger, wiser, more compassionate? What if this moment is doing the same? And third, we shift from victim to student. Instead of asking, "Why me?" we start asking, "What now?" Because the truth is, life owes us nothing. Not fairness, not predictability, not immunity from pain. But it does offer us something even more valuable, the opportunity to transform. There's this practice in Japan called kintsugi. When a piece of pottery breaks, instead of throwing it away, they repair it with gold. The cracks aren't hidden, they're highlighted. Because in their culture, they believe that something which has been broken and put back together is more beautiful than something that has never been broken at all. That's how I see life now. We all break. We all go through things that change us forever. But if we choose to, we can fill those cracks with gold. We can become stronger, not despite what we've been through, but because of it. I don't know what you're going through right now. I don't know what kind of pain life has handed you. But I do know this, you're not being destroyed. You're being reshaped. And one day, you're going to look back on this moment and see it for what it really was. The beginning of something new. So tell me, what is life teaching you right now? And what will you do with the lesson? Ever feel like you're living everywhere except where you actually are? I was sitting in a cafe the other day watching people go about their lives. Across from me, a guy was scrolling on his phone, his untouched coffee growing cold. A few tables over, a woman was nodding at her friend's words, but you could tell her mind was somewhere else. And then there was me, physically there, but mentally, I was off in another world, replaying old conversations, stressing over future deadlines, thinking about everything except the moment I was actually in. And that's when it hit me. How much of my life have I spent like this? Distracted, rushing, always half here, half somewhere else. Thinking happiness is in the next big thing, the next achievement, the next relationship, the next goal, while completely missing the life happening right in front of me. Buddhism has this core idea. The only moment that truly exists is now. The past? It's over. The future? Not here yet. But our minds? They're constantly bouncing between the two, stuck in regret or racing ahead with worry. And meanwhile, the present moment, the only place life is actually happening, is slipping right through our fingers. So what if we just stopped? What if we actually let ourselves be here? I used to think mindfulness was some complicated spiritual thing, something monks did in temples, not something you could bring into everyday life. But it's really just paying attention to your coffee, to your breath, to the sound of laughter in the next room. It's about noticing the details you usually rush past. There's this Zen saying, when drinking tea, just drink tea. Simple, right? But think about it, how often do we actually do that? How often do we let ourselves be fully in whatever we're doing, instead of half living it while thinking about something else? I remember the first time I really got this. It wasn't during some deep meditation. It was just a normal evening. I was walking home, my mind tangled in a mess of worries. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it. The sound of wind moving through the trees. And I mean really heard it. It was like my brain finally shut up for half a second, and suddenly the world came alive. The cool air, the rhythm of my footsteps, the way the streetlights cast long, golden shadows on the pavement. And in that moment, I realized something. Life is always happening. We just forget to show up for it. But why do we do that? Why do we spend so much time anywhere but here? Maybe it's because the present moment feels too simple. We're always chasing something. Success, love, validation, the next big thing. We tell ourselves that happiness is just around the corner, always in some future version of our lives. Or maybe it's because being fully present means actually feeling things. When we stop running, we have to sit with whatever's here. Our anxiety, our boredom, the discomfort of silence. And that's hard. It's easier to scroll, to distract ourselves, to jump ahead to what's next instead of sitting still with what is. But here's the truth. Happiness isn't waiting for you in some distant future. It's right here in the tiny moments you keep overlooking. It's in the first sip of coffee in the morning. It's in the way light spills through your window. It's in the laughter of someone you love. It's in the breath you're taking right now. And if you're not paying attention, you're missing it. So how do we actually start living in the moment? First, breathe. Right now, take a deep breath. Feel it. The way the air moves in and out of your lungs. That's life. That's now. Whenever your mind starts racing, come back to your breath. It's always there, waiting to anchor you. Second, fully engage in whatever you're doing. If you're eating, taste your food. If you're walking, feel your steps. If you're talking to someone, listen, really listen instead of planning what you'll say next. Treat life like it actually matters. Third, appreciate the small things. We're always waiting for big moments to make us happy, but real joy is hidden in the smallest details. The warmth of the sun on your skin, the way your favorite song makes you feel, the smell of fresh laundry. Start noticing. Fourth, stop trying to be anywhere but here. The past is done. The future is out of your hands. But this moment, this one right here, is yours. And it's enough, because this is your life. Right now, I think back to that day in the cafe. The guy still glued to his phone. The woman still checking her watch. And me, so lost in thought I almost missed a moment I'll never get back. If I could go back, I'd do it differently. Put my phone down. I'd take a sip of coffee and really taste it. I'd listen to the sound of people talking, the clink of cups on saucers, the faint music playing in the background. I'd let myself be there, fully, completely, because that moment, I'll never get it again, and neither will you. So tell me, what's happening in your life right now that you're not paying attention to? And what would change if you finally decided to show up for it? You know, looking back, I can see it now. That night, the one where I thought my world had collapsed, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning, but I couldn't see it then. All I knew was that something I had built my life around was gone, and I had no idea what was next. And that's the thing, isn't it? Nothing stays the same. Not our happiness, not our pain, not even who we are. Everything shifts. Everything moves. And the more we try to fight it, the more we suffer. Think about it. Have you ever held on to something so tightly, so desperately, just because you were scared to lose it? A relationship that had already run its course? A job that no longer felt right? A version of yourself that you had outgrown? The harder we grip, the more it hurts. It's like holding onto a rope that's pulling away from you. The tighter you squeeze, the deeper it cuts. But if you just let go, if you loosen your grip, stop resisting, that's when you finally find peace. That's when you make space for something new. There's this Japanese practice called kintsugi. It's the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. Instead of hiding the cracks, they highlight them. They don't see them as flaws. They see them as part of the story, as proof that something broken can still be beautiful. And maybe that's what life is doing to us when things fall apart. It's not breaking us. It's remaking us. So if you're in that place right now, if life feels like it's falling apart, I want you to ask yourself this. What if this isn't the end? What if this is just the start of something you can't see yet? Because one day you might look back and realize that this moment, the one that feels impossible right now, was actually the thing that set you free. And hey, if this message hit home for you, share it. Because trust me, someone out there needs to hear this today. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what's one thing in your life that felt like a loss, but looking back, turned out to be a blessing? I'd love to hear your story.